The morning Arthur Grimes padlocked the Whitmore bakery door, he was smiling, not the polite kind, the kind that said he'd been waiting for this exact moment for a long time. He pressed the notice against the wood, property condemned, debt unpaid, and smoothed it flat with his palm like he was hanging a picture he was proud of. Elena watched from across the street, flowers still on her hands from the batch she'd started at 4 in the morning, and felt something inside her go very quiet. The bread was still in the oven. If you've ever had someone take something from you before you were finished fighting for it, you already know exactly what she felt in that moment. Before we go further, if stories about ordinary people refusing to stay beaten speak to you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Every like reminds me to keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's go back to where this really began. The oven at Whitmore Bakery had been cold for 11 days before Elena lit it again. 11 days was how long it took to bury both her parents, sign the papers she didn't fully understand at the bank, eat the food the neighbors left on the porch, until the food stopped coming, and sit alone in the kitchen staring at the equipment her father had spent 20 years paying off. The big iron oven with the cracked handle on the left door. The long wooden table her mother had scrubbed so many times the grain had nearly disappeared. The shelf where her father kept his starter culture in a clay crock he'd carried from Missouri when Elena was 3 years old. A living thing he'd fed every day without exception, even the days he was sick, even the day her mother's breathing got bad and they both knew it wasn't going to get better. The starter was still alive. Elena almost couldn't look at it. She'd kept feeding it out of muscle memory, out of the same stubborn refusal to let things die that had gotten her through the first week. She wasn't sure yet whether that was strength or just the inability to stop moving. Silver Creek wasn't a cruel town by nature. It was just a practical one. Practical towns didn't have much patience for sentiment, and they had even less for a 24-year-old woman trying to run a business that 3 people had barely managed together. The conversations happened around her more than to her. She'd catch the tail end of them at the general store or the post office, voices dropping just a half-second too late. Feel terrible for her, of course, but someone should tell her. That Whitmore girl, bless her heart, she doesn't have the first idea. Debts on that building alone, not to mention the equipment loans. I heard Grimes at the bank is already. Arthur Grimes was already. That much she knew. Grimes ran the Silver Creek Savings and Loan from a tidy office above the hardware store, and he had a particular way of delivering bad news that made it sound like he was doing you a personal kindness. He'd sat across from Elena 3 days after the funeral, with his hands folded on the desk, and explained, slowly, like she might not follow, that the bakery carried a loan balance, that the loan was 2 months behind, and that while he had the deepest sympathy for her loss, the bank had obligations of its own. "What are my options?" she'd asked. Grimes had smiled the way he'd smile at her again weeks later, standing on the street outside. "Well, Miss Whitmore, you could sell. That's really the cleanest path at this point. The building has value, even if the business, well..." He'd left the rest of it unfinished, but she'd heard it anyway. Even if the business is finished. She hadn't sold. She hadn't agreed to anything. She'd thanked him for his time, walked out of his office, walked the 4 blocks back to the bakery, stood in the kitchen for a long time, and then started feeding the starter twice instead of once. That was her decision, not a dramatic one, not a speech, just the quiet, slightly irrational choice to take one more step rather than stop. The problem was that one more step didn't pay a loan balance. She had 40 pounds of flour left in the storage room, a small block of lard, some salt, 2 jars of dried rosemary she'd forgotten were there, the starter, the oven, and her own hands, which had helped in this kitchen since she was old enough to reach the table but had never run the operation alone. Her mother had done the planning. Her father had done the sourdough, the serious bread, the bread people came back for, the bread that had made the Whitmore name mean something on the frontier. Elena had done what she was asked and learned what she could without ever being the one responsible for the outcome. She was responsible now. She relit the oven at 4:45 in the morning, more because she couldn't sleep than because she had a plan. The kitchen was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She mixed the first dough by feel more than measurement, the way her father had tried to teach her. Flour tells you what it needs. You just have to stop assuming you already know. And she got it wrong the first time. The texture was off. She knew it before she even finished the fold. She started again. The second batch was closer. Not right, but closer. She worked it until her shoulders ached, shaped it badly, let it proof too long, and pulled it from the oven at 7:30 to find bread that was edible, but nowhere near what her father would have put on a shelf. She ate a heel of it standing at the table and thought, "This is what I have to work with." Herself, imperfect, time, limited, flour, 40 pounds, and then nothing. She started the next batch. The days that followed had a grinding sameness that she hadn't expected. She'd imagined, in some vague way, that the effort would build towards something, that each morning would feel slightly more like progress. Instead, it mostly felt like repetition that hadn't earned the right to be called a routine yet. She woke in the dark. She fed the starter. She built the dough. She made mistakes she understood and a few she didn't. She pulled bread from the oven that ranged from acceptable to genuinely good, depending on factors she was still learning to control. She put a small sign in the window, "Open, fresh bread daily." The first 3 days, almost no one came. One woman she didn't recognize stopped on the second morning and bought a small loaf, more out of curiosity than anything else. She didn't come back. 2 men came in on the third day, looked at the selection, bought nothing, and left without making eye contact. Silver Creek had formed an opinion, and opinions in small frontier towns had a weight to them that felt almost physical. The Whitmore bakery had been closed for nearly 2 weeks. The parents were gone. The girl was too young and too inexperienced, and the flour would run out before she figured anything useful out. And everyone was a little sorry about it, but no one was going to pretend that sorry changed the arithmetic. She heard it from Martha Fitch, who was at least honest enough to say it to her face. Martha was 60-something, had run the boarding house for 30 years, and had known Elena's mother well enough to deliver the message with something resembling kindness. "I'm not trying to be harsh," Martha said, stopping by one afternoon while Elena was cleaning the front window. "But people are saying you ought to let Grimes find you a buyer before it gets worse. You've got time to get something out of it. If you wait too long—" "I appreciate you telling me," Elena said. "Elena, I really do." She kept wiping the window. "Thank you, Martha." Martha stood there another moment, then left. That night, Elena sat in the kitchen after closing and allowed herself 15 minutes of something that wasn't quite despair, but was close enough to be uncomfortable. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't fully fix. Her hands were chapped from the flour and the cold water. She'd made 17 loaves today and sold 4. The flour situation was becoming something she was going to have to face very soon. She gave herself the 15 minutes. Then she got up, covered the proofing dough for tomorrow morning, and went to bed. On the 9th day, she found her father's notebook. She'd been looking for the ordering records, prices, suppliers, quantities, trying to understand the business side she'd always left to her parents. The notebook was tucked behind a stack of old invoices in the desk drawer her father had called the important drawer, which had always held things he considered too significant to file and too necessary to lose. His handwriting filled the pages in the compressed, careful way of someone who wasn't sure he'd have enough paper to say everything he needed to say. It wasn't an instruction manual. It was something more like a conversation he'd been having with himself for years. Notes about flour protein content and fermentation timing and the way altitude affected rise, but also other things. Observations. September 12th. Whole wheat blend too dense. Customers said nothing but bought less. September 14th. Back to the original ratio. October 3. Elena helped with shaping today. She has good instincts she doesn't trust yet. She read that line 3 times. She'd had no idea he'd noticed. He wasn't a man who said things like that out loud. Not to her, not that she could remember. He'd shown her things rather than explaining them, guided her hands on the dough, demonstrated the fold without labeling it a lesson. She'd thought she was just helping. She hadn't known he was watching. She closed the notebook and sat with that for a while. The next morning, she tried something different. She'd been working from memory and guesswork, building toward her father's sourdough by feel. Now she worked from his notes, specifically a set of entries from the previous winter where he'd been experimenting with fermentation time and cold temperatures. The kitchen ran cold in early morning. She'd been fighting it. His notes suggested going with it instead. The loaves that came out of the oven that afternoon were different, not perfect. She'd slightly misjudged the salt, she knew it the moment she tasted the crust. But structurally, texturally, they were closer to her father's bread than anything she'd managed in the previous 8 days. She felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph. Something quieter. Permission, maybe. The sense that it was possible, that the gap between where she was and where she needed to be was distance rather than wall. She sold 11 loaves that day instead of 4. It wasn't enough to change anything material. But something about her had changed, and she thought the bread could taste it. The morning Arthur Grimes padlocked the door, she had been open for 17 days. She'd sold out the day before, completely, every loaf, for the first time since she'd reopened. It wasn't a large number, but it was the entire production. She'd gone to sleep that night, calculating how long she could stretch the remaining flour, thinking about whether she could borrow against anything to buy more before the week was out, feeling for the first time that the calculation wasn't entirely hopeless. She'd started the morning batch at 4:15. She first heard the sound at 7:10, a heavy metallic click, the kind a padlock makes when it closes. She came out of the kitchen with flour on her hands and saw Grimes through the front window, already stepping back from the door, the notice pressed flat against the wood. She stood very still. "Miss Whitmore." He said it through the glass without opening the door, which told her everything about what kind of man he was. "The bank has exercised its right to secure the property pending payment resolution. You have 30 days to settle the outstanding balance or arrange a sale. I've left the contact information in the notice." Her bread was still in the oven. She could smell it from where she stood. The particular smell of sourdough in the last few minutes before it needed to come out. That complicated, yeasty, slightly acidic warmth that her father used to say was the closest thing to proof that you'd done something right. "The bread will burn," she said. Grimes looked at her. "Pardon?" "I have 3 loaves in the oven. If I can't go back into the kitchen, they'll burn." He blinked. She could see him calculating. The liability of a fire, probably, more than any concern for her bread. He pulled a key from his coat pocket, unlocked the padlock, and held the door open. She went back into the kitchen. She pulled the loaves from the oven. She stood there holding them, still hot, wrapped in the cloth her mother had always used, and decided that she was not going to cry in front of Arthur Grimes. She didn't. She set the loaves on the table and looked at them for a moment. 3 perfect loaves that she had no way to sell now, and thought, 30 days. 30 days to find an amount of money she had no clear path to finding. 30 days before the building she'd grown up in, the oven she'd learned to read by touch, the starter her father had carried from Missouri, all of it became someone else's problem to resolve. She picked up 2 of the loaves. She left the kitchen. She walked past Grimes without speaking. She walked out of the bakery and directly across the street to Martha Fitch's boarding house and knocked on the door. Martha opened it, took one look at Elena's face, and stepped back to let her in without asking a single question. Elena set 1 loaf on Martha's kitchen table. "I need a place to think," she said, "and I'd like to know if you know anyone who might be interested in buying bread, regularly, a lot of it." Martha sat down across from her. She looked at the loaf. She reached over and broke a piece from the end, the way you do when you're too hungry or too interested to wait, and put it in her mouth. She chewed for a moment. "That's your father's bread," Martha said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like recognition, the way you'd say that's your grandmother's face to someone you were seeing clearly for the first time. "Almost," Elena said. "I'm still getting there. How much time do you have?" 30 days. Martha broke off another piece. "Then you'd better get somewhere faster than almost." It wasn't encouragement the way people usually meant it. It was the frontier version, the kind that didn't soften the problem, but also didn't pretend it was bigger than it was. Martha had lived 30 years on the frontier, and she knew that most things that looked like walls were actually corners if you got close enough to see them straight. Elena walked back to the bakery with the 3rd loaf still in her hands. Grimes was gone. The padlock was back on the door, but he'd left her the key. She found it taped to the notice, with the bank's address printed neatly below it. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. Her father's sign was still above the door. Whitmore Bakery. Est. 1871. The paint was fading on the letters, the wood behind it warped from years of weather, but it was there. She unlocked the door. She went back inside. She sat in the kitchen for a long time, her father's notebook open on the table, the 3rd loaf beside it, and she started to think. Not about what she'd lost, not about Grimes, or the notice, or the 30 days. She thought about the bread, about what it had taken to get these 3 loaves right, about the 9 days before she'd found the notebook and the 8 days after. She thought about the notes her father had kept. She has good instincts she doesn't trust yet. And about the fact that he'd written that without ever saying it out loud, which meant he'd believed it enough to write it down but thought she wasn't ready to hear it yet. She thought maybe she was ready now. She picked up a pencil and turned to a blank page at the back of the notebook and started writing her own notes. Not about flour or fermentation, about the 30 days. Who might buy bread? Who in Silver Creek ordered supplies regularly and might need something a bakery could provide? Ranch operations. The boarding houses. The hotel that had opened 2 years ago on the north end of town. The mining camps she'd heard were growing on the eastern ridge. She wrote until the light started failing. Then she lit the lamp and kept writing. The bread was still warm beside her. She broke a piece from the third loaf and ate it slowly, paying attention to it the way her father had always told her to. Taste what you made, not what you intended. And she thought, this is close. This is real. This isn't charity and it isn't luck. This is 11 days of work in a cold kitchen and one notebook and whatever it is that makes a person keep feeding a starter even when they're not sure why. 30 days. She closed the notebook. She had a lot of work to do. The list Elena made that first night covered nearly 2 full pages by the time she set the pencil down. She'd written it fast, the way you write things when you're trying not to let doubt catch up with the idea. Names, places, rough calculations that may or may not hold up in daylight. Ranch operations within a 10-mile radius. The hotel on the north end. Martha's boarding house, which she already knew about. 3 smaller rooming houses she'd delivered to once or twice as a girl, riding along with her father on Saturday morning runs when she was small enough to sit on the flour sacks in the back of the wagon without them shifting under her weight. The mining camps were the wild card. She'd never dealt with them directly. Her father had mentioned them in passing. Big appetite, rough clientele, cash in hand. But the Eastern Ridge Road was bad in early spring, and she didn't have a wagon, and she was getting ahead of herself. She folded the list and put it inside the notebook. Then she spent the next 3 days being turned down. Not dramatically, not cruelly, for the most part. The hotel manager, a thin man named Copeland who wore his watch chain too short, heard her out with the patience of someone who had already decided the answer before she walked in. He told her the hotel had a cook who handled their bread needs in-house and that he wasn't looking to change the arrangement. She asked if she could leave a sample. He said he'd pass it along. She knew he wouldn't. The first of the rooming houses was closed, shuttered since winter apparently, which she should have known. The second one's owner, a Mrs. Patton, bought 2 loaves on the spot and told her she'd think about a regular arrangement, which Elena translated correctly as probably not but filed under possible anyway. The third was run by a man named Horace Duggan, who talked for 20 minutes about the quality of bread in general, mentioned twice that his late wife had been an excellent baker, and bought nothing. She went home and fed the starter and started the next morning's dough, and didn't let herself add up the numbers because she already knew what they'd say. The flour situation was going to become critical by the end of the week. She had enough for perhaps 4 more baking days at her current production rate, and her current production rate wasn't generating enough sales to cover a new supply order. The math was a loop that closed on itself. She needed money to buy flour, needed flour to make bread, needed bread to make money. And the only way out of the loop was to find someone willing to commit to a regular order before she ran out of raw material. She needed a contract, not a customer. That distinction was something she kept turning over in her mind. Customers were unpredictable. A contract was a floor. Something she could take to a supplier and say, I have guaranteed income. I need terms. Without something like that, she was just a girl with a padlocked building and 30, now 27, days to prove she had a business rather than a habit. She'd written Nathaniel Blackwood's name on the list that first night, and then crossed it out and then written it again, smaller, in the margin. Everyone in Silver Creek knew the name. You couldn't operate in this territory for more than a week without hearing it. Blackwood Ranch was the largest cattle operation within 40 miles, which meant it employed a significant number of men year-round, which meant it had a consistent and substantial need for food. Her father had mentioned Blackwood once or twice, never as a customer, always as a reference point the way you'd mention a mountain when giving directions. Just something large and fixed that you navigated around. She'd crossed his name out because approaching someone like Nathaniel Blackwood felt like a different category of thing than knocking on Horace Duggan's door. Blackwood wasn't a man you walked up to with 2 loaves of bread and a hope. He was a man who had people who handled procurement and accounts, and those people had processes, and processes took time she didn't have. She wrote his name again anyway, smaller, just in the margin, just in case. On the 4th day after the padlocking, she sold out again. This time 14 loaves, which wasn't coincidence. She'd shifted her production slightly towards smaller sizes, priced them sharper, and positioned two in the window where the light hit them in the late morning when foot traffic on the main street was highest. Small adjustments. The kind of thing her father would have noticed and not commented on, just registered quietly in his notebook. A woman she didn't recognize bought 3 loaves at once, which was unusual enough that Elena asked, as casually as she could manage, whether she was entertaining. "No," the woman said, not unfriendly. "I'm at Blackwood Ranch. Cook sent me into town for supplies. We've been going through bread faster than the cook can make it, and he's tired of the complaint." Elena handed her the change and said, very carefully, "If the ranch ever needs a regular supply, I'd be glad to discuss terms." The woman looked at her, a real look, not the polite dismissive kind, and said, "I'll mention it." Elena did not let herself think about it too much after that. Thinking about it too much was how hope became a trap. She went back into the kitchen and started cleaning the proofing bowls and kept moving. He came in 5 days later. She almost missed who he was, which she thought about afterward with a complicated feeling she couldn't quite name. She'd been in the back dealing with a dough that wasn't behaving. Too slack, she'd added the water too fast. She was still learning to adjust for the humidity changes in early spring. And she heard the door and called out that she'd be right there, and finished the fold before she came out front. He was standing at the display counter with his hat in his hand, which struck her as the first thing. Most men who came into the bakery left their hats on. He was looking at the bread, not in the way customers usually looked, scanning for what they wanted and calculating the price, but studying it. The way you'd study something you were trying to understand. I was older than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd had an expectation. Mid-40s, maybe. A face that had been outdoors for most of those years. Not a tall man, but a solid one. The kind of solid that isn't about size, but about how a person occupies the space they're standing in. "What's the fermentation time on the sourdough?" he asked, without looking up. It was not the question she'd expected. "Overnight cold proof," she said, coming around the counter. 12 to 14 hours depending on the temperature in the kitchen. "Why?" Now he looked up. "I'm trying to understand why it smells different from most sourdough I've bought." "Different how?" "More something. Acidic isn't the right word. More complex." "The starter is older," she said. 40-some years. It has a different microbial balance than a young culture. You can't replicate it by starting fresh, you just have to develop it over time." She paused. "It was my father's." He looked at her for a moment. "You're Elena Whitmore." "Yes." "Nathaniel Blackwood." He said it without the weight some men put on their own names, like they're setting something heavy on the table. Just information. "My supply person mentioned you'd said something about a contract." "I did. I have 37 men on the ranch year-round, more during drives, but we won't count that yet. They eat twice a day on site, and they go through bread the way you'd expect men doing physical labor to go through bread." He picked up one of the sourdough loaves. Just picked it up, held it in both hands the way her father used to, testing the weight and the give of the crust. "My cook is good at meat. He's not good at bread, and he knows it, and it makes him irritable, which makes everyone else irritable. I've been looking for an outside solution for about 6 months. Elena kept her voice even. "What kind of numbers are you thinking?" 40 loaves a week minimum. More like 60 when I've got extra hands. Delivered, not picked up. The ranch road's not a good use of your time on foot. I'd need reliability above everything else. If I tell my men there's bread, there has to be bread. 40 loaves a week. The number landed somewhere behind her sternum, and she let it sit there while she thought through what it meant. The flour she'd need, the oven time, the scheduling, whether she could actually produce that volume consistently on her own. "I can do 40, she said. 60 would require me to expand my operation slightly, but 40 I can commit to." "Starting when?" "Give me a week to confirm supply arrangements. After that, twice weekly deliveries, Tuesday and Friday." He set the loaf down. "Price?" She named a number she'd calculated the night before, not the number she'd have liked, but a number she could defend. The margin was thin but real. He didn't negotiate. That surprised her enough that she almost said something about it and stopped herself. "One thing," she said instead. He waited. "I want this to be a business arrangement, not a favor." She watched his face for the reaction. "I don't want to be someone you're helping out. If the bread doesn't meet your standard, I want you to tell me and I'll fix it, or we end the contract. That's the only way I can run this right. He picked up his hat. Miss Whitmore, I've done business with people at every level of this territory for 20 years. I know the difference between charity and commerce. He settled the hat back on his head. This is commerce. The bread is good. Your terms are fair. Terms? I'm not doing you a favor. I'm solving a problem I've had for 6 months. He put a hand out. She shook it. Tuesday, she said. Tuesday, he confirmed, and walked out. She stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed. Then she went to the back, sat down on the stool she kept by the work table, put her face in her hands, and breathed through the shaking that had been waiting to happen since the moment he walked in. Not relief. Not yet. Relief came later, after the flour order was confirmed and the first delivery was made and the check cleared. What she felt right now was more like the feeling after you've been holding your breath for a long time and finally remembered you're allowed to stop. She gave herself about 3 minutes of that. Then she stood up and started calculating how much flour she needed to order. The supplier she ended up negotiating with was a man named Aldous Webb, who operated a grain distribution operation out of the next town over and had done business with her father for years. He was skeptical of her, not unkindly, but plainly. He said he'd heard about the situation at the bakery and that he'd need payment terms he could count on. She told him about the Blackwood contract. Webb knew Blackwood. Everyone knew Blackwood. The skepticism didn't disappear, but it shifted into something more like caution, which was workable. They settled on a 30-day net arrangement, which gave her the breathing room she needed to get the first delivery cycle running before she had to settle the first invoice. She walked out of Webb's office with a handshake agreement and a headache starting behind her left eye. And on the walk back to Silver Creek, she did the arithmetic 4 different times and got the same answer each time, which was that she was going to be fine for the next 30 days and absolutely not fine if anything went wrong. Nothing could go wrong. She increased her production the same day she got back, working until 10 at night to get the extra dough proofing for the morning. She burned the back of her right hand on the oven door and didn't notice until she was washing up and saw the mark, a thin red stripe across the knuckles that she pressed a damp cloth to and kept moving. The first Tuesday delivery was 22 loaves, packed in the flour sacks she'd washed and dried specifically for transport. She didn't have a wagon. She'd arranged to borrow Martha's handcart, the one she used for laundry, and she loaded it before 5 in the morning and made the 3-mile walk to Blackwood Ranch on a road that was still soft from last week's rain, which meant the cart bogged twice, and she had to repack the load to keep the bread level. She arrived with flour in her hair, mud on her boots up to the ankle, and 22 intact loaves. The cook, a heavy-set man named Peters, who had, Elena gathered immediately, strong opinions about his own kitchen, came out to receive the delivery with the expression of a man who'd been told to try something he hadn't asked for. He looked at the loaves. He opened one sack, took out a loaf, turned it over. "Crust looks right," he said, as if admitting something against his will. "It's a harder crust than some people expect," Elena said. "But it holds up better through the day, especially if the men are taking it out on work." Peters broke the loaf open. She watched him. He looked at the crumb structure, then tore a small piece from the interior and ate it standing there in the yard, without any expression at all. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll let you know if there's a problem," he said finally, which she understood to be the closest she was going to get to approval from Peters, and she took it. She walked back to town with the empty cart and started the next batch. The second delivery went smoother. The road was drier. She'd reorganized the packing method and nothing shifted. Peters met her at the gate this time, which was different from last time, and said, without preamble, "Men like the sourdough. Asked if you do a wheat variety." "I can," she said. "Give me until next Tuesday." He nodded and took the sacks. She developed the wheat variety in 3 days, working from her father's notes and a set of her own adjustments for the lower protein content in what Webb had available locally. It wasn't perfect on the first try. The crumb was denser than she wanted, and the flavor needed another day of fermentation, but the second attempt was something she'd put her name on. Peters, on receiving the wheat loaves the following Tuesday, said, and took them without further comment. This, Elena had already decided, was Peters's version of enthusiasm. What she hadn't anticipated was that Nathaniel Blackwood would be there the second time. He was crossing the yard when she arrived, heading from the barn toward the main house, and he changed direction when he saw her. "Delivery 2, he said. Delivery 2, she confirmed. He fell into step with her toward where Peters was waiting. Any problems? The road's manageable. I'd prefer a wagon, but I'm working with what I have. He glanced at the handcart. I can lend you one of the ranch's smaller wagons on delivery days. Driver's not needed. You comfortable with a single horse? She'd grown up in a frontier town. She'd been driving a single horse since she was 12. Yes, she said. I'll arrange it. You can pick it up Tuesday morning, return it the same evening. She stopped walking. He stopped too because she had. Mr. Blackwood, I know, he said. It's not a favor. I want the bread delivered in good condition, and that means not having it jostled in a handcart for 3 miles. It's a practical solution to a logistical problem. He said it like he'd anticipated the objection, which irritated her slightly, and also, she had to admit, resolved it cleanly. All right, she said. I've been thinking, he said, after a pause that was long enough to be deliberate. Victoria Langford is coming through Silver Creek in about 3 weeks. Do you know her? Elena knew the name the way she knew Blackwood's name, as a landmark. Victoria Langford was a trading merchant who operated across several frontier territories, connected to supply chains and settlement operations in ways that Elena had never had reason to think about directly. I know of her, she said carefully. She eats at the ranch when she comes through. It's a standing arrangement. She moves livestock and equipment for me seasonally, and we settle accounts in person. He was watching her, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the evaluating way she'd noticed in their first meeting. She supplies several frontier settlements across the territory. Food contracts are a significant part of how those settlements operate. Elena understood what he was telling her. She wasn't sure she wanted to want what it implied, and she was absolutely sure she wanted it anyway. I'm not going to make a situation out of it, he said, but I thought you should know she'll be here. Thank you for telling me, Elena said, and meant it without any of the complicated feelings attached. She thought about Victoria Langford on the walk home. She thought about what it would mean to supply multiple settlements, the volume, the logistics, the impossibility of managing it with her current setup. She thought about the one oven in the bakery, the cracked handle on the left door, the way it ran 3 degrees hotter on the right side that she'd learned to account for. She thought about the 40 pounds of flour she'd started with. There were things she needed that she didn't have. More equipment, probably. Help. Real help. Not borrowed handcarts and goodwill. The bakery couldn't scale on her own, not to the level that would make a conversation with someone like Victoria Langford mean anything. She thought about that for 3 days before she did anything about it. Margaret Holloway had lived in Silver Creek for 15 years and was, depending on who you asked, either the most capable woman in town or the most difficult. The truth, as Elena understood it from years of observation, was that Margaret was both, and the people who called her difficult were usually the ones who'd wanted something from her that she'd declined to give. She was 53, had been widowed young and hadn't remarried, ran a small laundry operation with a degree of organizational precision that would have impressed a military quartermaster, and had spent a decade as the head cook at the mining camp on the Eastern Ridge, before the camp downsized and let her go. Elena knocked on her door on a Wednesday morning. Margaret opened it, looked at her, and said, I wondered when you'd come around. I haven't asked you anything yet, Elena said. No, but you've got the look of someone who's about to ask me to work for them. Margaret stepped back from the door. Come in. I made coffee. They talked for 2 hours. Not about terms, initially, about bread. Margaret knew fermentation, had learned baking from necessity at the mining camp when the cook they'd hired turned out to have, as she put it, an optimistic relationship with the truth regarding his skills. She wasn't as technically deep as Elena's father had been, but she was experienced and efficient, and efficiency was what Elena needed more than anything. I can't pay you what you're worth yet, Elena told her. I can pay you fairly given what I'm currently bringing in. If the Langford situation develops the way I'm hoping, that changes. Margaret poured more coffee for both of them. What does fairly mean in numbers? Elena told her. Margaret didn't respond for a moment, which Elena took as negotiation starting. That and a percentage of any new contract that comes from the settlement work, Margaret said finally. If your bread is what gets you the Langford deal, I want to know I'm part of what made it happen. Elena hadn't thought about it that way. She turned it over for a moment. 3% of net on settlement contracts. 5. 4. Done, Margaret said, and picked up her coffee. Samuel Carter was a different conversation entirely. He was 19, had come to Silver Creek with an older brother who'd since moved on to the mining camps, and had wound up staying because he'd found work and hadn't found a reason to leave. He'd been doing odd jobs around the hardware store when Elena noticed him one afternoon carrying a load of lumber with a careful efficiency that reminded her of something her father used to say about how people who were good with their hands were good with their hands at everything. She asked him, on impulse, if he'd ever baked anything. He said he'd made biscuits. She told him that didn't count. Then she asked if he wanted to learn. He looked at her with the skeptical confusion of a 19-year-old being offered something that seemed simultaneously too small and too uncertain to evaluate. "Learn to bake," he said. "I need someone who can handle production while I'm managing orders and delivery logistics. I can teach the technical side. What I need is someone who can follow a process precisely, work early hours without complaint, and tell me when something looks wrong instead of hoping it'll fix itself." He thought about it for approximately 10 seconds. "How much?" She told him. It was less than Margaret, appropriately. He was learning, not arriving with skills. He agreed, and she thought he would have agreed for less, not because he was a pushover, but because he was 19 and wanted something to do that wasn't lumber. He started 2 days later, arriving at 4:30, as she'd asked, and immediately asked 4 questions about the starter that told her he'd been thinking about what she'd said rather than just showing up. The questions weren't sophisticated, but they were curious, and curiosity was something you couldn't manufacture. "You smell it every morning?" he asked, watching her check the starter. "Every morning. The smell tells you more than the look does." "What does it smell like today?" "Active. Ready. A little sharp. Means the fermentation ran fast overnight, probably the temperature. I'll adjust the proofing time." He watched her adjust. He didn't take notes, but she could see him filing it away with the careful attention of someone who knew they'd need to retrieve it later. By the end of the first week, he could shape loaves without her watching. They weren't her shaping. His were slightly tighter, actually, which produced a different but not inferior result. But they were consistent, and consistency was the beginning of skill. With Margaret and Samuel in the operation, the bakery shifted in a way Elena hadn't entirely anticipated. It became louder, for one thing. Margaret had opinions about workflow she expressed freely. Samuel asked questions that could spiral into a 15-minute detour if she wasn't careful. And the kitchen that had been so quietly solitary for 17 days was suddenly occupied in a way that was occasionally chaotic, and more often than she'd expected, genuinely useful. Margaret caught a proofing error on the 3rd day that Elena, who was managing the flour inventory and the delivery schedule simultaneously, had completely missed. She caught it the way experienced people catch things. Not dramatically, just a slight pause and a redirect. "This one's overproofed. Pull it now or you'll lose the structure." Elena pulled it. The loaf was salvageable. Without Margaret, it would have been a loss. She didn't say anything beyond thank you, but she wrote it down in the notebook that evening, in her own section at the back. M caught the overproofing. Pay attention to timing on heavy production days. 3 weeks moved faster than 30 days had any right to move. Victoria Langford arrived on a Thursday. Elena knew she'd arrived because Blackwood sent word via the same supply woman who'd first mentioned the ranch's bread needs. A brief note, 3 lines, letting her know that Mrs. Langford was at the ranch, and that dinner was at 7 and that he thought Elena might want to make sure the Friday delivery included the wheat variety. Elena delivered on Friday morning, as scheduled, and Peters met her at the gate, which was normal now, and took the delivery without ceremony, which was also normal. Blackwood appeared as she was turning the wagon to leave. "She'd like to meet you," he said. Elena had been up since 4. She had flour somewhere in her hair that she hadn't managed to get out entirely, and her coat had a patch on the left elbow she kept meaning to replace. She was aware of all of this. "Now?" she said. "If you have time." She had time. She made herself have time. She tied the wagon horse to the post and followed him toward the main house. Victoria Langford was not what she'd imagined, and she couldn't have said exactly what she had imagined. She was perhaps 60, though she carried it in a way that made age seem like something that had happened to other people, and she'd just observed it. She was seated at Blackwood's dining table with papers spread in front of her, a coffee cup she'd clearly been working on for a while, and the expression of a woman who evaluated things for a living and never entirely stopped. She looked at Elena the way she'd probably looked at the bread, not unkindly, but without pretense. You're the baker, she said. I am. Sit down. She gestured to the chair across from her without looking at Blackwood, who remained standing near the door. Nathaniel says you're reliable. I don't take his word on most things, but I take his word on reliability because he values it above almost everything else, and he's a good judge of it. Elena sat. I supply 4 settlements in the Eastern Territory, Langford said. 2 of them have been managing bread production internally, which is expensive and inconsistent. The other 2 have been going without, which creates problems I won't bore you with. I need a baker who can produce volume, maintain quality, and deliver on a schedule I can build a supply chain around. She picked up her coffee. Can you do that? Elena thought about the handcart, the mud on the road, Peter saying, Margaret catching the overproofed loaf, Samuel learning to shape at 4:30 in the morning. She thought about 40 pounds of flour in the notebook with her father's handwriting and a 30-day deadline that now had 4 days left on it. Yes, she said. I can do that. But I need to know the volumes and delivery windows before I can tell you what that commitment looks like operationally. I won't agree to something I can't execute. Victoria Langford set down her coffee and looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same neighborhood. Good, she said. Let's talk numbers. The numbers Victoria Langford put on the table were not small. 2 settlements to start, Harrow's Crossing and a newer outpost called Delfield that had been operating for 14 months and was still working out what it needed to sustain itself. Combined population of roughly 340 people, with a fluctuating transient population of travelers and traders that could add another 50 on any given week. Langford's estimate for bread needs was conservative by design. She said this plainly, the way she said most things, without apology for the plainness. She preferred to underpromise the supply requirement and let the baker build toward real demand rather than overcommit and collapse. 120 loaves per week across both settlements, she said. Split between the 2 delivery points, however, makes geographic sense. I'll need a trial period of 6 weeks before we formalize anything on paper. If the quality holds and the schedule holds, we write a contract. Elena did the arithmetic in her head while Victoria was still talking. 120 loaves per week on top of the 60 she was already committed to for Blackwood Ranch, which had grown from 40 to 60 in the 3 weeks since the first delivery. Because Peters had quietly requested the additional volume and Blackwood had simply sent word that the arrangement was expanding without making a ceremony of it. She was currently at capacity with 3 people and 1 oven. 120 more loaves per week was not possible, not with the equipment she had. She said this. Victoria looked at her without particular surprise. What would you need to make it possible? A second oven, minimum, possibly a larger proofing space. The kitchen runs warm in the afternoon and it's affecting my cold fermentation if I'm running production through the day. More staff, at least 1 additional person. She paused. And capital to acquire those things, which I don't currently have in the quantity required. What quantity are we talking about? Elena had spent 3 weeks thinking about expansion in the abstract, the way you think about things you need but can't yet afford. Not seriously enough to price it out, but enough that the rough numbers were already sitting somewhere behind her other thoughts. She named a figure. It was less than she actually needed, and she knew it, but it was the number she could defend with specifics. Victoria wrote it down. She wrote things down in a small leather book she kept on the table beside the papers, and she wrote quickly. The shorthand of someone who had recorded a great deal of information over many years and had developed efficiency about it. I don't lend money, Victoria said. I want to be clear about that. But I have a relationship with a merchant bank in the territory that facilitates credit arrangements for suppliers I work with. If you're a Langford supplier, they'll take your application seriously. I won't co-sign anything, but I'll provide a letter confirming the pending contract and the projected volume. That's as far as I go. That's enough, Elena said. That's more than enough. Victoria looked at her. Don't thank me yet. The credit application will require documentation you may or may not have. The rate will be higher than you'd like because you're a new business without established financials. And if the trial period doesn't work out, the letter becomes meaningless, and you're sitting with a debt and no contract to service it. She closed the leather book. I'm not a benefactor. I'm a merchant solving a supply problem. The risk is yours. I understand that, Elena said. Good. Victoria picked up her coffee again. Then we have a trial arrangement. 6 weeks. First delivery to Harrow's Crossing in 10 days. 10 days. Elena walked back to the wagon with the particular kind of calm that comes from being too overwhelmed to express it. Blackwood fell into step with her without announcing it, which she'd noticed he did. Appeared beside you rather than approaching you, as if he'd always been there. "How did it go?" he asked. 10 days to figure out how to produce twice my current volume with equipment I don't have yet." He was quiet for a moment. "The bank application. You'll want to move on that today if you're going to have any chance of seeing funds before the first delivery." "I know." The merchant bank she works with is Heller and Associates. Their territory office is in Millfield, 2 hours by horse. If you send a letter today, they'll want to see you in person before the week is out. She looked at him sideways. "You've dealt with them before." "Everyone in the territory has dealt with them eventually." He stopped at the post where the wagon horse was tied. "The rate will be aggressive. Don't accept the first number they give you." "I wasn't planning to." He untied the horse for her, which she could have done herself and which she didn't comment on. "The second oven is the bigger problem. New equipment takes time to source and install. Used equipment is faster, but you're buying someone else's problems." "I know someone who might have what I need," she said, and got up onto the wagon. She was thinking of Aldous Webb, who dealt in more than grain. He had a warehouse of miscellaneous equipment he'd taken as payment in kind over the years. And she'd seen the outline of a large iron oven through the back door of his operation on her last visit. It might be nothing. It might be exactly what she needed. It was worth the conversation. She sent the letter to Heller and Associates that afternoon. She rode to Webb's the following morning. The oven in his warehouse was older than the one in the bakery and considerably larger. A commercial unit that had come out of a hotel kitchen in some town to the north that had, Webb explained with the vagueness of a man who didn't think provenance mattered much, closed under circumstances he wasn't entirely clear on. The oven had 2 chambers and ran on the same wood fuel setup she was already using, which mattered because a conversion would have cost time she didn't have. It needed cleaning. The door seal on the lower chamber had deteriorated and would need replacing. The temperature gauge was missing, which was a problem only if you hadn't spent enough time with ovens to read them by sound and smell and the behavior of dough. And Elena had. "What do you want for it?" she asked. Webb named a price that was too high by about a third. Elena offered a price that was too low by about a fifth. They settled somewhere in the middle, and she arranged for it to be transported to the bakery the following week, pending the credit arrangement coming through. She was operating on the assumption that it would come through. She was aware that this was a risk. She did it anyway, because 10 days didn't leave room for sequential decisions. The meeting at Heller and Associates took place 4 days after she sent the letter. She rode to Millfield in the early morning, arrived with her documentation, the Blackwood contract, the letter from Langford, 3 weeks of sales records she'd kept in the notebook, and a handwritten projection of the next 6 months that she'd spent 2 evenings working out with Margaret checking her arithmetic, and sat across from a man named Frederick Heller, who was younger than she'd expected and had the particular courtesy of someone trained to seem pleasant while making assessments. He asked her questions for over an hour. She answered them directly. When he said the initial rate he was proposing, she said, "That's too high," and told him what she'd accept and why, with the margin calculations laid out clearly enough that disagreeing required him to argue with her numbers rather than just her. He came down on the rate. Not as far as she'd asked, but enough. She signed the paperwork and rode back to Silver Creek and arrived at the bakery at 7 in the evening to find Margaret and Samuel still in the kitchen, working a late batch they'd taken on themselves without being asked, because they'd both understood that everything was compressing and someone needed to keep the ovens running while she was dealing with bankers. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them. "We got the credit," she said. Margaret didn't look up from the dough she was shaping. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you wouldn't have come back looking like that if you hadn't." Samuel looked up. He was 20 now, had turned 22 days ago. A fact Elena had forgotten until Margaret mentioned it, and she'd given him an extra heel of bread, which he'd accepted with the solemn dignity of someone receiving a significant gift. "What do we do first?" he asked. "Tomorrow we clean the space in the back room for the second oven. Webb's delivering it in 4 days. Day after delivery, we fire it up and run test batches to learn how it behaves." She came fully into the kitchen. "I need one more person, someone who can handle delivery logistics. I can't keep driving the Blackwood wagon and managing the settlement route simultaneously once Langford's deliveries start. It's 2 different directions." "I know someone," Samuel said. Henry Briggs. He's been doing freight runs for the hardware store. Knows the roads east. Is he reliable? He's been doing the hardware job for 8 months without a problem. Introduce me tomorrow. Henry Briggs turned out to be a quiet man in his 30s who drove like he'd been born in a wagon seat, and who, when Elena explained the delivery requirements and the road conditions, asked exactly the right questions about load weight and axle capacity and said nothing that wasn't relevant. She hired him on a per-delivery basis to start, with the understanding that it would become regular if the Langford trial held. The second oven arrived on a flatbed on a Tuesday morning and took 4 men and most of the morning to move into the back room through the alley door. It was large enough that they had to remove the door frame temporarily, which Margaret supervised with the expression of someone watching a complicated procedure she wasn't confident in but had decided not to interfere with. The first firing of the new oven was that afternoon. Elena ran it empty for 2 hours first, the way you always should with a new-to-you oven. Let it find its temperature, listen to how it settled, smell what was burning off the interior surface, and wait until the smell became clean. The lower chamber ran slightly cool, as she'd suspected from the deteriorated seal. The upper chamber was strong, actually stronger than her original oven's right side, which meant she needed to adjust her rack positioning. She made notes. Pages of them. The oven had a personality, like all ovens did, and you had to learn it the same way you learned anything, by paying attention and being wrong several times before you got it right. The first full test batch using the new oven produced 20 loaves that ranged from slightly underdone on the lower chamber to nearly perfect on the upper. She adjusted, ran a second batch, got closer. By the end of the first full day, she had a workable understanding of the new equipment. Not mastery, that would take weeks, but enough to trust the output. Margaret ran the original oven. Elena ran the new one. Samuel moved between them, managing proofing and shaping and the constant restocking of the wood fuel, which turned out to be a more significant logistical consideration than she'd accounted for. 2 ovens consumed nearly twice the wood she'd been ordering, and she'd need to renegotiate that supply separately. She added it to the list. The list had been growing for weeks, and it now lived in a second notebook she'd bought specifically for operational tracking because her father's notebook had become something she didn't want to use for grocery orders and supply calculations. Her father's notebook stayed on the shelf above the work table. Her notebook stayed on the desk in the front room where she did the accounts. She worked on the accounts late, after Margaret and Samuel had gone. This was her least favorite part of the operation. Not because the numbers were impossible, but because they required a different kind of attention than the baking did. A sustained logical focus she had to build toward rather than fall into. Her father had kept accounts the way he'd kept most records, compressed and careful, and she'd learned enough watching him that she could manage the basics. But the complexity was growing, and she knew that at some point the basics wouldn't be enough. She thought about this on the 9th night before the first Langford delivery, sitting at the desk with the accounts ledger open and a cup of cold coffee she kept meaning to warm up. She'd been at this for 5 hours. The numbers were right, she'd checked them twice, but the structure of the ledger was becoming unwieldy in a way she could feel even if she couldn't precisely identify it. She closed the ledger and went to bed at midnight and was back in the kitchen at 4:15. The first Harrow's Crossing delivery was scheduled for a Friday. Elena and Henry loaded the wagon on Thursday evening. 50 loaves, mixed varieties based on what Langford had told her the settlement would accept, packed in the cleaned flour sacks and arranged so the weight distributed evenly. Henry checked the axle pins before they covered the load. He did this without being asked, which confirmed she'd made the right hiring decision. The road to Harrow's Crossing was 2 hours and 20 minutes in good conditions. It was not good conditions. It had rained 2 days before, and the eastern stretch of the road had a low section that flooded seasonally, and they hit it 40 minutes out and spent 25 minutes getting the wagon through it, Henry managing the horse with the focused quiet of someone who'd done this before. Elena walking alongside to keep the weight down, while the wheels found purchase in the mud. They arrived in Harrow's Crossing with the bread intact and Elena's boots destroyed. The settlement supply manager was a woman named Clara Adkins, who had the specific exhaustion of someone responsible for keeping several hundred people adequately fed and supplied in a location that was not convenient to anything. She looked at the wagon with something between hope and skepticism. The look, Elena recognized, of someone who'd been disappointed by previous arrangements and was trying not to assume this one would be different. Clara took one loaf out of the first sack, broke it open, and stood there in the middle of the settlement's main square, eating a piece of it without ceremony. "How often?" she asked. "Twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays." "Can you do whole wheat? Half the settlement is from farming families and they'll complain about white bread." "Yes." "What about anything with seeds? The cook here has been trying to make seeded loaves and they keep coming out wrong." "What kind of seeds?" "Whatever's available. Sesame, sunflower, whatever Webb's carrying." "I'll have something for you by Tuesday." Clara repackaged the loaf she'd opened. "If this keeps up, I'll want more volume by month 2. "We can discuss that closer to the time." Clara nodded and directed her settlement's receiving crew to take the delivery. The crew was 2 teenagers who handled the sacks with more care than Elena expected, which she attributed to Clara's management. She and Henry drove back to Silver Creek. The low section on the road was easier westbound, slightly better drainage on that side, and the afternoon sun had dried the worst of it. Elena spent most of the return trip with a seed loaf recipe running in her head, working through the sesame ratios, the way seeds affected hydration and crust formation, what her father's notes said about additions and how she'd modify it for higher volume. She had a seeded wheat loaf developed and test-baked by Sunday. It was good. Not immediately perfect. The sesame ratio was too assertive on the first bake, and she pulled it back on the second. But the second batch was something she'd put her name on. Samuel liked it enough to eat half a test loaf at breakfast, which she took as a reliable indicator because Samuel ate things she produced with the honest assessment of someone who had no professional stake in flattering her. "It's better than the plain wheat," he said. "I know, I'm not sure why yet. The seeds add something to chew on, makes it feel more like a whole meal." She looked at him. He shrugged, slightly self-conscious, the way he got when he said something that turned out to be accurate. She wrote it down in her notebook. Seeds change the eating experience, not just the flavor profile. Consider this for the settlement market, practical food for people doing physical work. The second delivery to Harrow's Crossing included 20 seeded wheat loaves alongside the regular varieties. Clara received them, broke the seal on one of the seeded loaves, ate a piece, and said, "Yes, more of these." The Delfield deliveries started the following week. The road was different, longer, better maintained, which actually made it easier in some ways and introduced new complications in others because the distance meant leaving before 4 in the morning to arrive at a reasonable hour. Henry took those runs alone after the first one, with Elena riding along only to establish the relationship with Delfield's receiving contact, a man named Roy Packard, who was less picky than Clara but needed more reassurance about consistency, which Elena provided by showing him the production schedule and the quality checking process she ran on every batch. Roy seemed most reassured by the production schedule written out on paper. Some people were like that. The written record meant something they couldn't articulate but felt strongly. She gave him a copy. 3 weeks into the trial, the Whitmore Bakery was producing a volume that would have seemed implausible to Elena on the day she relit the original oven with 40 pounds of flour and no certainty about tomorrow. The 2 ovens ran 6 days a week. Margaret managed the original with a settled competence that had stopped needing Elena's oversight almost immediately. Samuel had developed beyond what she'd expected, to the point where he'd begun making small adjustments to his process without checking with her first. Adjustments that were, when she examined them, consistently correct. She'd had to tell him this because he'd been tentative about it. "You changed the proofing time on the rye yesterday," she said one morning. "Why?" He'd braced slightly, the way he did when he wasn't sure if he'd done something wrong. "The temperature dropped overnight and the dough was running slow. If I'd held to the original time, it would have been underproofed." "Right. I should have asked you first." "No," she said. "That's exactly the judgment I need you making. The whole point is that you can read what the dough needs without waiting for me to tell you." She went back to the oven check she'd been doing. "Keep doing that." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, in the careful way of someone filing a new rule into the correct place. The thing she hadn't anticipated about building a team was how much it changed her own work. She'd expected it to free up her time, which it did, but she hadn't expected it to change the quality of her thinking. With Margaret and Samuel managing production, she could move between the kitchen and the desk and the delivery logistics without the grinding constant interruption of doing everything herself. And somewhere in that space she started seeing things she'd been too close to see before. She saw that the Blackwood contract had a ceiling she was going to hit within 2 months, unless she addressed the variety limitation. Peters had mentioned twice, obliquely, that the ranch hands were interested in something sweet, and she'd been too busy to act on it. She saw that the loan repayment schedule she'd agreed to was manageable, but left very little buffer for anything unexpected, which on the frontier meant she was one bad week away from difficulty. And she saw that Arthur Grimes had been in front of the bakery 3 times in the past week, not doing anything, just passing by, in the way of someone who might happen to be walking that direction, except that Grimes's office was above the hardware store, and the hardware store was in the other direction. Each time, he'd looked at the building, at the light in the windows, the wagon parked out front, the small crowd that had started gathering before opening most mornings. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She filed it in the same part of her mind where she kept things she needed to understand better before she acted on them. On the 23rd day of the trial period, she got a note from Victoria Langford. Langford was back in the territory. She moved constantly. Silver Creek was a regular stop, but not her base. And the note said she'd heard from both Clara Adkins and Roy Packard, and that what she'd heard was satisfactory, and that she'd like to discuss the formal contract terms the following Thursday. Elena read the note at the desk at 9 in the evening, after the accounts were done and the kitchen was clean and Margaret had gone home and Samuel had gone to wherever Samuel went in the evenings, which she'd never asked because it wasn't her business. She sat with the note for a few minutes. Satisfactory. From Victoria Langford, operating through Clara Adkins and Roy Packard, that word carried the weight of something considerably stronger. Langford didn't soften assessments upward. Elena had understood this about her from the first meeting. Satisfactory meant good. From Langford, it might mean excellent. She wrote in her notebook for a while. Not about the contract, about the things she'd been circling for several weeks without writing down directly. The question of what happened next. Not in 30 days. Further than that. She'd started this to save the bakery. She'd saved the bakery. The padlock was gone, the loan was current, the building was operating at a level her parents had never reached in terms of volume. She'd done what she'd set out to do, and it had taken approximately 6 weeks of the hardest work she'd ever done. And now the opportunity in front of her was substantially larger than the problem had been. She wrote, "What is this becoming?" And then, "What do I want it to become?" She didn't answer either question that night. She closed the notebook and banked the oven fires and locked the front door and walked home through the dark, quiet street, and the bakery lights were off behind her, but she could still smell the bread through the walls, the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been working all day and hadn't entirely let it go. She was 1 block from home when she heard footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful, not the random sound of another person on the street, and turned to find Arthur Grimes walking toward her with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who'd been working up to something. She stopped and waited. "Miss Whitmore," he said, stopping a few feet away. He had the slightly winded quality of someone who'd been walking fast. "I wonder if I might have a word." "It's late, Mr. Grimes." "I know. I apologize for the hour." He didn't look apologetic exactly. He looked like a man who'd calculated that the hour was necessary. "I've been wanting to speak with you, and it keeps not being the right moment." She waited. "The bank has received an inquiry," he said, "about the Whitmore property, a buyer who's interested in making an offer." Elena felt something go still in her. "The loan is current," she said. "The bank has no basis for a sale." No. This wouldn't be the bank initiating anything. This would be a purchase offer to you. The bank would simply, "I'm aware of the inquiry because the interested party has spoken with us about financing arrangements for the purchase." He paused. "It's a significant offer, Miss Whitmore, more than the building is worth by standard valuation. Whoever wants it enough to pay above market." "Who?" she asked. Grimes hesitated. The hesitation was not the kind that came from forgetting. It was the kind that came from deciding. "I'm not at liberty to say at this stage. The interested party has asked for discretion while they determine whether an approach is worth making. But I thought, given everything, you should know it exists." She looked at him for a moment in the dark street. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "My answer is no." "You haven't heard the offer." "My answer is no," she said again. "If whoever it is wants to make a formal offer, they can do it in writing, in my name, and I'll read it. But I'm not selling." She paused. "And if the bank is involved in encouraging this inquiry in any way that isn't entirely straightforward, I'd like to know about it now rather than later. Grimes pulled back slightly. Not physically, he didn't move, but something in his face shifted into a more careful register. The bank is simply a financial resource, that's all. Good, she said. Good night, Mr. Grimes. She walked the rest of the way home and sat in her kitchen for 20 minutes before she went to bed, turning the conversation over and examining it from different angles, the way you turn a piece of dough to check for inconsistencies before you commit to the proof. Someone wanted the bakery, not the building. Buildings on the frontier were available. Someone wanted the bakery specifically, wanted it enough to involve the bank and approach through back channels rather than directly. And Grimes had come to her at 9 o'clock at night on a dark street, which was not the behavior of a man acting straightforwardly. She needed to know who it was. She needed to know before Thursday, before the Langford contract, before she signed anything that made the operation more valuable and therefore more worth taking. She added it to the list in her notebook, the last entry of the day, written in the dark kitchen by the light she'd lit just for this. Find out who wants the building. Find out why. Find out what Grimes isn't saying. Then she went to bed because the oven needed to be lit at 4:15, and the bread wasn't going to make itself. She asked Martha first. Not because Martha knew everything that happened in Silver Creek, though she came close, but because Martha had the particular quality of someone who'd been in a place long enough to understand the difference between what people said and what they meant. And she didn't embellish. If Martha told you something, it was because she was reasonably sure it was true. Elena stopped by the boarding house the morning after Grimes's visit, before the second oven firing, leaving Margaret in charge of the kitchen with instructions that she didn't need to explain twice anymore. She brought a loaf of the seeded wheat because Martha had mentioned it twice in passing and Elena had kept forgetting, and she sat at Martha's kitchen table and told her what had happened on the street the night before without editorializing. Martha listened the way she always listened, with the stillness of someone who wasn't just waiting for you to finish. Above market value, Martha repeated. That's what he said. And he wouldn't say who. No. Martha turned the loaf over in her hands, which was something she did with bread the same way she did with information, examining it from different angles before she committed to an opinion. There's only one reason someone buys above market and doesn't want their name attached to it yet. They're not sure the seller will say yes, and they don't want the refusal on record. She set the loaf down. Or they're buying something they don't want people knowing they want. Which one do you think this is? Could be both. Martha cut 2 slices, handed one to Elena. Who benefits from owning your building specifically? Not just any building on this street, yours. Elena had been turning that question over since the previous night. The bakery occupied a corner lot on the main commercial street. Better positioning than average, higher foot traffic, but not so dramatically superior that it explained an above-market offer. The building itself was solid but old. The equipment was hers and would leave with her. What wouldn't leave with her was the location and the name, and whatever it was that the Whitmore Bakery had started to mean in Silver Creek again. Someone who wants the foot traffic, she said, or someone who wants to control what's on that corner, or... She stopped. Or someone who doesn't want you there, Martha said, which is a different thing entirely. That was the thought Elena hadn't let herself complete the night before. She let it sit on the table between them now and looked at it. Who didn't want the Whitmore Bakery operating and growing on that corner of Silver Creek's main street? Who had enough money to pay above market, enough interest and discretion to approach through the bank's back channels, and enough connection to Grimes to make that approach natural rather than forced? She thought about the merchants who'd doubted her, the ones who'd watched her carry bread on a handcart in the dark and assumed she'd fail. Most of them had simply been wrong and moved on. She'd seen it in the way they greeted her now, the slight recalibration in how they looked at her when she walked into the supply office or the post office. Not apology, just adjustment. But adjustment and acceptance weren't the same thing, and there was a particular kind of person on the frontier for whom someone else's unexpected success felt like a personal grievance. Do you know anyone Grimes is close to? Elena asked. Socially, outside the bank. Martha thought about it. He plays cards on Thursday evenings, at Renner's place on the east side. Who else plays? Couple of the merchants, Copeland from the hotel sometimes. Martha paused. Silas Drummond used to. I haven't heard whether he still does. Silas Drummond. Elena turned the name over. Drummond operated a general supply operation on the south end of town. Food staples, dry goods, the kind of stock that overlapped with what a bakery might carry in a secondary capacity. He'd always been at the edge of her awareness, the way a weather pattern on the horizon was at the edge of your awareness, not immediately relevant but worth monitoring. He was the only food-adjacent merchant in Silver Creek who hadn't, in the 7 weeks since she'd reopened, said a single word to her directly. Most people had said something, even if it was just a nod. Drummond had looked through her twice on the street with the deliberate quality of someone making a choice to look through you rather than at you. "Drummond," she said. Martha didn't confirm or deny. She broke a piece from the seeded wheat loaf and ate it, and after a moment said, "That's a very good loaf," which was confirmation enough. Elena went back to the bakery and didn't say anything to Margaret or Samuel. She thought about it through the morning batch, through the second oven's first run of the day, through the accounts she managed between the kitchen and the desk. She thought about it the way she thought about a dough that wasn't doing what she expected, systematically, checking each variable rather than trying to solve all of it at once. What did she actually know? That someone had made an above-market inquiry to the bank, that Grimes had come to her directly and unusually, that Drummond hadn't spoken to her and had a plausible motive, that the inquiry had come now, in the window between the Langford trial period and the formal contract signing. That timing was the detail that wouldn't let her alone. If someone wanted to buy the bakery as just a building or just a location, the timing wouldn't matter particularly. But if the goal was to acquire the bakery before it became too established to reasonably purchase, before a major supply contract was signed and the business became formally significant, then the timing made perfect sense. Another 3 weeks and the Langford contract would be signed, the operation would be documented, the value would be on paper in a way that made any purchase offer substantially more expensive. Someone was trying to buy her out before she knew what she had. She sat with that for the rest of the morning, and by early afternoon had decided what she needed to do. She needed to know for certain, and she needed to know before Thursday. She also needed to not do anything that looked like she knew, because if Drummond, or whoever it was, understood she was watching, they'd adjust their approach in ways she couldn't predict. She needed help. Not from Martha, who'd already given her what she had. She needed someone who operated in a different circle. She needed Nathaniel Blackwood. She sent a note to the ranch asking if he had time to speak the following morning. His reply came back by late afternoon. Brief, no ceremony, the way he communicated. "Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. I'll come to you." He arrived at 8:10, which for Blackwood meant something had delayed him, and he apologized for it, which was not something she'd seen him do before in the small ways. He came into the bakery while Margaret and Samuel were in the middle of a production run and looked around the kitchen in a way that was different from his first visit, noting the changes, the second oven, the expanded workspace, the organized efficiency of 3 people who'd been working together long enough to stop explaining everything out loud. "You've built something real here," he said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation of fact. "I need your help with something," she said, and told him about Grimes and the inquiry and the timing and what she and Martha had worked out about Drummond. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. A lot of men listened to women speaking about business the way they listened to weather reports, lightly, with the private assumption that the conclusion had already been reached by someone else, and this was just the delivery of it. Blackwood listened like the information mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Drummond," he said. "You know him." "I've done business with him, not recently." A pause that carried something she couldn't entirely read. "He approached me 2 years ago about a supply arrangement, food staples for the ranch. The numbers he offered were good enough that I looked at them seriously, and then I found out he'd been diluting the grain stock he was selling to the mining camp, mixing in lower-grade material and charging for standard quality." Elena stared at him. "And?" "And I didn't make the arrangement. I also told the camp's supply manager what I'd found, and they ended their relationship with him." He looked at her directly. "He knows that I know. He's never said a word to me about it, which tells you something about the kind of man he is. He'd rather pretend it didn't happen than have the conversation." "Is there any formal record of what he did to the mining camp?" "The camp manager kept records of the discrepancies. Whether those records are still accessible, I don't know." Elena thought about this. If Drummond buys the bakery, what does he do with it? Closes it or converts it, Blackwood said without hesitation. He doesn't want to run a bakery. He wants to remove a competitor that's starting to take food staple business away from his dry goods operation. Your bread has been good enough that people are buying from you things they used to buy from him, or would have bought from him. He's looking at the Langford contract and seeing a business that's about to become significant, and he's trying to get in front of it. That's what I thought. So what do you want to do about it? She'd been working on that since the previous morning, and she had a shape of an answer, but not all of it. I need the inquiry on record, formally. If Drummond makes an official offer in writing, I can decline it in writing, and the refusal is documented. But if he keeps operating through back channels and the bank, I'm trying to defend against something I can't prove is happening. You want him to commit, Blackwood said. I want it documented. If he's approaching the bank about financing an acquisition, there are records, loan inquiry records. But I don't have access to those. I do, Blackwood said. Not directly. But I have a relationship with the Territory Banking Commission. I've served on a review panel for them twice. If there's a formal inquiry at Silver Creek Savings and Loan that involves a question of process, I can raise it at the commission level and the inquiry becomes part of a review record. Elena looked at him. That's a significant thing to do. It's a significant situation. He said it simply. You're not asking me to do anything dishonest. You're asking me to use a legitimate channel to create transparency. That's what the commission exists for. I don't want you to take on something that causes you problems. Drummond has been a problem in this territory for a long time. The grain dilution wasn't the first irregular thing he'd done, just the one I happened to catch. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. I'll make the inquiry today. It won't produce an immediate result, but if Drummond is doing what you think, it will create a paper trail that makes it much harder for him to operate quietly. He left, and Elena went back into the kitchen and picked up where Margaret had left off on the wheat batch. And Margaret gave her a look that asked without asking, and Elena said, "We'll see," which was all she had. Thursday came fast. The Langford meeting was at 10 in the morning at Blackwood's ranch, the same dining table where the first conversation had happened, but different now because the papers Victoria spread out were a real contract rather than a proposal. Elena had spent 2 evenings reading the draft Langford had sent ahead, going through it clause by clause with the methodical focus she'd learned to apply to anything she didn't fully understand. There were 3 terms she wanted amended. The delivery window language was too vague on her end of the obligation. The pricing adjustment mechanism didn't account for flour cost fluctuations adequately. And there was a non-compete clause that would have prevented her from supplying any other settlement within 50 miles without Langford's written consent, which was too restrictive for a business she intended to keep building. She'd written the amendments out in plain language and brought the paper with her. Victoria read the amendments without particular reaction. She changed the delivery window language without comment, the way someone accepts a correction to a fact they'd gotten slightly wrong. The pricing adjustment took longer. They went back and forth on it for 20 minutes, Victoria arguing for a fixed-rate review annually rather than a floating mechanism, Elena holding to the floating mechanism because flour prices on the frontier moved with grain harvests, and she couldn't absorb a bad harvest year on fixed pricing. They settled on a hybrid that was more complex than either of them had proposed originally, and that Elena was fairly sure was actually better than what she'd asked for. The non-compete clause Victoria struck out entirely. I put it in as standard language, she said. If you push back on it, you understand your own business. Keep it out. Elena signed this contract at 11:40 in the morning, and Victoria countersigned, and Blackwood witnessed both signatures in the capacity of a formal witness without making anything of it. Afterward, Victoria poured coffee. She'd brought a tin of it herself, from somewhere that produced it better than what was generally available in the territory. And the 3 of them sat at the table in a way that was different from the previous 2 meetings. Not celebratory, but settled. The feeling of something that had been under construction finally becoming load-bearing. "You've done well in 6 weeks," Victoria said to Elena. It was as close to a compliment as Victoria delivered, and it landed accordingly. "The settlements have noticed. Clara Adkins told me your seeded wheat loaf has become something people specifically ask about, which is harder to accomplish than people think. Frontier settlers are not sentimental about food. If it's good enough to request by name, it's genuinely good." "Clara's good at feedback," Elena said. "She tells me what's working and what isn't. It's useful. She runs a tight operation out there. I've worked with her for 3 years. Victoria drank her coffee. I'm going to add a third settlement to the contract in approximately 90 days if the first two hold. I wanted you to know that so you can plan for it rather than being surprised. A third settlement. Elena kept her expression steady. Which one? Fort Callum. It's a military outpost on the northern route, about 60 men stationed there plus civilian staff. Bread is currently coming in from Millfield, which is unreliable in winter because of the northern pass. I've been looking for an alternative source for 2 seasons. Military contract. Consistent volume. A government-adjacent arrangement that would be more paperwork than anything she was currently managing, but also more stable than any commercial agreement. Elena turned it over once and said, "I'll be ready in 90 days." Victoria nodded. She looked at Blackwood briefly, then back at Elena. One other thing. There's been word in the territory merchant community about an acquisition attempt on your building. I want you to know I'm aware of it. Elena went very still. What have you heard? That Silas Drummond approached 2 different investment contacts about financing a purchase before he went to the local bank. He's been talking to people he shouldn't have been talking to, and some of those people talk to people I know. Victoria set down her cup. I don't involve myself in other people's property disputes. But if someone attempts to interfere with a Langford supply contract through a supplier acquisition or any other means, I treat that as interference with my operation. And I have resources to address it that are not available to most parties. The room was very quiet for a moment. Is that something Drummond knows? Elena asked. He will, when I send him a letter this afternoon. Victoria said it with the complete calm of someone describing a routine task. I've dealt with his type before. They retreat when the cost of advancing becomes clear to them. The letter will make the cost clear. Elena thought about saying thank you and decided it wasn't what was needed here. I appreciate you telling me directly. It's in my interest, Victoria said simply. Don't mistake it for something else. After the meeting, Blackwood walked her to the wagon. The ranch's wagon that she'd been using for deliveries, which had become so normal that she'd nearly forgotten it was borrowed. The afternoon was bright and cold, the kind of spring cold that kept reminding you winter hadn't entirely made up its mind yet. You knew, Elena said, about what Victoria knew, about Drummond talking to investors. I heard something yesterday afternoon, he said, after I made the inquiry to the Banking Commission. Someone who heard about the inquiry made a connection and sent word to me. Why didn't you tell me before the meeting? He considered the question the way he considered most things, not quickly, but genuinely. Because if I'd told you before you walked into a contract signing, you'd have spent the meeting managing 2 things instead of 1. The contract needed your full attention. Drummond could wait an hour and a half. She wanted to argue with this and found she couldn't, quite, because he was right. She might have argued with it anyway, except that she was tired and the contract was signed, and right now that was enough. The Banking Commission inquiry, she said. Where does that stand? They've opened a preliminary review of Grimes's loan inquiry records, just a review. But Grimes knows about it, which means Drummond knows about it, and that changes the calculation for both of them. He paused. Drummond won't make a formal offer now. The paper trail is too exposed. So it's over? The acquisition attempt is over. Whether Drummond finds another way to make your life difficult, I don't know. People like Drummond don't stop being who they are. They just look for different angles. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. I'll deal with that when it arrives. I know you will. He stepped back. Something in the way he said it was different from his usual directness, slightly unguarded, the word landing in a different register than his normal transactional precision. She noticed it and didn't comment on it, and he didn't add anything, and she drove back to Silver Creek. The following week was the kind of week she'd stopped being surprised by. A series of problems, each manageable individually and collectively exhausting. The lower chamber seal on the second oven had deteriorated faster than she'd expected, probably because the oven had been sitting unused for too long before she acquired it, and the reactivation had stressed the material. She caught it on Tuesday morning when the output from that chamber ran 10 degrees cool and the bottom crust on 6 loaves came out underdone. She pulled those loaves before they went into a delivery and redistributed the load to the upper chamber in her original oven. She sourced a replacement seal from a metalworks in Millfield. Henry picked it up on a return freight run and managed the repair herself on Wednesday afternoon with Samuel holding the chamber door steady while she worked, which was awkward and took longer than it should have, and resulted in a burn on her forearm from a heat pocket she hadn't anticipated. "Done," she said when the seal was seated and the door moved correctly. "You're burned," Samuel said. "I know. It's not serious." She flexed her arm. The burn was real but shallow, a reddened stripe that was already cooling. "Fire the chamber up and let's run a test cycle." He fired it. She watched the temperature behavior for 40 minutes while Margaret ran the original oven and the afternoon's production continued, and by 5 o'clock the lower chamber was running correctly, and the week's loss was 6 loaves and an afternoon's repair time, which was irritating but not catastrophic. She wrote it in the notebook. Lower chamber seal. Replace at 6 months, regardless of visible condition. Don't wait for symptoms. The accounts that week showed the first month in which income from all 3 revenue streams, the ranch contract, the Silver Creek retail sales, and the Langford settlement deliveries, exceeded expenses by a margin that was small but real. Not the margin she needed to feel comfortable, but real. A positive number on the correct side of the ledger for the first time since she'd reopened. She sat with that for a while. Margaret noticed her looking at the ledger longer than usual. "Good news?" she asked from across the kitchen. "We made money this month." Margaret stirred the pot she was working on. She'd taken to making a midday soup from leftover bread ends and whatever was available, which had become an unofficial meal for the 3 of them during the long production days. "Well," she said, "there you go." It wasn't a dramatic response. It was the right one. Elena had expected Drummond to go quiet after the banking commission inquiry and Victoria's letter, and in the direct sense he did. No more approaches through Grimes, no more above-market inquiries, no more deliberate absences on the street. But quiet and gone were different things, and she discovered this on a Friday morning when Webb called on her in person, which he'd never done before. She always went to him, and told her that Drummond had approached him about a long-term grain supply arrangement. Elena kept her expression neutral. "What kind of arrangement?" "Exclusive," Webb said. He was a direct man, and he was being direct now, which she appreciated, even though what he was saying had an edge to it. "He's offering me a 3-year exclusive contract for all my territory grain distribution, which would mean I couldn't supply you." The thing about supply chains was that they seemed like background infrastructure until the moment they weren't. Webb was her primary flour source. If Webb signed an exclusive with Drummond, she needed a new supplier, and the alternatives she knew of were more expensive and farther away. And the timing would intersect with the Fort Callum contract expansion in 90 days. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I'd think about it." Webb looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you about it because I've done business with your family for 12 years, and I think you should know. I haven't decided anything. The exclusive terms. What's he offering you?" Webb told her. It was a good number, not a great number, but structured with payment reliability that a small distributor like Webb would find genuinely attractive, guaranteed quarterly payments, rather than the invoice-based arrangement she had with him. She thought about it for a moment, doing the math on what Webb needed versus what she could offer. She wasn't in a position to match Drummond's guaranteed quarterly terms. Not yet. But there was something Drummond couldn't offer Webb that she could. "I can give you a 3-year supply agreement," she said. "Not exclusive on your end. I'm not going to ask you to close off other business. But committed volume from me, increasing by 12% in year 2 and another 8% in year 3, based on the settlement expansion I have coming." She paused. "And I'll agree to quarterly invoicing with a 10-day payment guarantee. If I'm ever late, you can terminate the agreement without penalty." Webb looked at her. "You're asking me to turn down an exclusive for a non-exclusive. I'm asking you to choose a growing business over a blocking move. Drummond doesn't want your grain, Webb. He wants my supply chain. If you sign as exclusive, you're not getting a great customer. You're helping him disrupt an existing one." She kept her voice even. "You can make your own decision about what that's worth, but that's what the offer actually is." Webb was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window of her front room, then back at her. "The 12% in year 2, that's real volume." "It's real. I can show you the Langford contract projections." She showed him. He read through the relevant pages with the patience of a man who read documents carefully and didn't skim. Then he handed the papers back. "I'll tell Drummond I'm not interested in the exclusive," he said, "and I'll want the 3-year agreement in writing. I'll have it drafted by Monday." He nodded and stood to go. At the door he stopped. "Your father was a good man," he said. I don't say that as a way of saying something about you. It's worth saying, and I don't think I said it when he died. She hadn't expected that. She took a moment. Thank you, Mr. Webb. He left and she stood in the front room for a minute, and then she went back into the kitchen because the second oven needed checking and there was a seeded wheat batch that Samuel had been managing and she wanted to see how it was running. That evening, after the day's work was done, and Margaret had gone and Samuel had gone and Henry had returned the wagon and gone, she sat at the desk in the front room and wrote a letter to Arthur Grimes. Not a threatening letter. Not a letter that mentioned Drummond or the banking commission or any of the previous week's maneuvering. A simple, formal letter noting that the Whitmore Bakery was current on all loan obligations, that she anticipated continued operational growth, and that she expected the building to remain in her ownership for the foreseeable future. She closed the letter. I trust this resolves any outstanding questions regarding the property. She sealed it, wrote Grimes's name on the front, and set it on the desk to be delivered Monday morning. Then she opened her father's notebook, not her own, but his, and turned to the entry she'd read that first night with her hands still shaking. October 3rd. Elena helped with shaping today. She has good instincts she doesn't trust yet. She read it again. She'd read it a dozen times since that first night, maybe more. But this time it felt like a different sentence than the one she'd found in the abandoned drawer. Not a note about a girl who needed to trust herself, but a record of something that had already happened. An observation about someone who had already been doing the thing, even before she'd known she was. She closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf where it lived, above the work table that had once been her mother's, in the kitchen that had been her family's and was now hers, in the building that Silas Drummond had tried to take and Arthur Grimes had tried to sell, and the town of Silver Creek had assumed she would eventually give up. She turned off the lamp. She locked the front door. She walked home through the dark, quiet street, and the bakery stood behind her on the corner with the Whitmore name still on the sign above the door. And tomorrow the oven would be lit at 4:15, and the bread would be made, and the deliveries would go out, and the work would continue in all its unglamorous, unrelenting, completely ordinary difficulty. She was, she realized, not waiting for anything anymore. She was already in the middle of what she'd been trying to reach. The letter to Grimes was delivered Monday morning, as she'd planned, by Samuel on his way in from wherever he slept, which turned out to be a room above the harness shop 2 streets over. She'd finally learned this by accident when Henry mentioned it in passing, and she'd realized she'd been paying a man for 2 months without knowing where he lived, which said something about how little space she'd had in her head for anything outside the work. Grimes sent no reply. She hadn't expected one. What she hadn't expected was that 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when she was in the middle of calibrating the second oven's upper chamber after a temperature inconsistency she'd noticed in the previous day's output, Arthur Grimes would walk through the bakery's front door for the first time since he'd padlocked it. She heard the bell above the door, the small brass bell her mother had hung there 30 years ago, and that Elena had never taken down, partly from habit and partly because it worked, and came out from the kitchen with flour on her forearms, and found him standing at the counter looking at the display with the careful neutrality of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was waiting for the right moment to say it. "Mr. Grimes," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He put his hat on the counter, which meant he intended to stay long enough that holding it would become awkward. "I received your letter. I thought you might. I want to—" He stopped, started again. "I want to clarify my role in the recent inquiry regarding this property." "All right." He looked uncomfortable in a way that was genuine rather than performed, which she registered. Arthur Grimes was not, she had decided some time ago, a fundamentally bad man. He was a man who operated within the logic of his own institution and had, in this particular situation, allowed that logic to carry him somewhere he shouldn't have gone. The difference between that and malice was real, even if the consequences could look similar. "Drummond came to me in a professional capacity," Grimes said. "He had a legitimate inquiry about acquisition financing. I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of what was or wasn't filed, given the commission review, but I want you to understand that at no point did I take any action against your loan standing or your ownership status." "I know," she said. "The loan is current. The ownership is mine. Those facts were never in dispute." "No." He looked at the bread in the display case for a moment. "I should not have come to you on the street at that hour. That was not appropriate conduct." She waited. I had a relationship with Drummond that I allowed to affect my professional judgment, he said. I'm not proud of it. He picked up his hat. The commission review will conclude without findings, because there's nothing improper in the documentation. But I wanted you to hear directly from me that the manner in which certain things were handled was not consistent with how I try to conduct my business. It was not, she thought, a complete accounting. There was more he wasn't saying, and probably more he'd never say, about how close the situation had come to becoming something harder to walk back from. But it was what he'd come to say, and she understood the weight of a man like Grimes standing on the other side of her counter saying it. I appreciate you coming in, she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 4 seconds later. She had the expression of someone who'd been listening without listening, the frontier version of privacy. That was the banker, she said. Yes. He apologized? Close enough. Margaret made a sound that conveyed a complicated opinion in a single syllable and went back to the kitchen. Elena stood at the counter for another moment, looking at the empty doorway, and then followed her. The Fort Callum contract came through in exactly 90 days, as Victoria had projected, which Elena had not entirely believed would happen on schedule, because nothing in the previous 3 months had happened on schedule, and she'd stopped expecting it. But Victoria operated with a precision that the frontier's general disorder hadn't managed to erode, and on the 90th day a formal contract arrived by courier with the military outpost seal and Victoria's countersignature in terms that were cleaner than anything Elena had negotiated independently, because the military had its own contracting process, and the process, whatever its limitations, produced clear language. 60 loaves per week to Fort Callum on the northern route. Henry would do those runs with a second driver he'd brought on, a younger man named Eli who drove the way Henry drove, which was to say carefully and without drama. Elena had met Eli twice, and both times had come away with the impression of someone who'd been taught by someone good, which she took as a sufficient recommendation. 3 contracts, 3 settlement routes, the ranch, the retail sales in Silver Creek, which had grown steadily enough that she'd extended the shop hours and added a small selection of pastry items on Saturdays. Not complicated ones, not yet, but the kind of thing her mother had made. Simple hand pies with dried fruit, a brown sugar shortbread that used the rendered lard she was already buying for other purposes, a dense molasses cake that kept well and traveled and that settlers could buy whole and eat across several days. Samuel had developed the molasses cake recipe largely on his own after she'd described what she wanted and left him to work it out, checking in twice and finding him both times closer than she'd expected. The cake had become, in the space of 6 weeks, the item people came in specifically to buy, the way the seeded wheat had become what Clara Adkins' settlers requested by name. She thought about that sometimes, about how the things that worked best were often the things she'd allowed to develop, rather than forced. The seeded wheat because Clara asked and she responded. The molasses cake because she described a need and Samuel filled it in his own way. The morning rush that had organized itself because Martha had mentioned to 3 people that the Whitmore Bakery was worth stopping at, and those 3 people had mentioned it to others, and the information had moved through Silver Creek the way information always moved through small towns, quietly and faster than anyone planned. She had not built any of it alone. That was the thing she kept returning to. In the evenings after the kitchen was clean and the notebooks were updated and the accounts were balanced or nearly balanced. She had not built it alone, and she'd had to learn that from scratch, because the part of her that had stood in the cold kitchen on the first morning and decided she was going to save her parents' bakery had been operating on a private, unexamined assumption that the doing was hers to do entirely, that asking for help was its own kind of failure, a proof of insufficiency that would confirm what everyone who doubted her had already decided. She'd been wrong about that, completely, specifically wrong, in a way that she was still understanding the shape of. Margaret wasn't just efficient. She was the person who caught what Elena missed, and what Elena missed when she was managing 3 contracts and 2 ovens, and a loan repayment schedule was a great deal. Samuel wasn't just a baker learning a trade. He was someone whose questions made her examine things she'd stopped questioning, and his questions were good because he didn't know yet what he wasn't supposed to ask. Henry was reliable in the way that allowed her to stop thinking about the roads once she'd set the schedule, which was a specific and valuable kind of freedom she'd underestimated until she had it. And Martha, who had given her the room in the boarding house kitchen and the honest word about Drummond and the piece of bread broken off without ceremony on the day Elena had shown up with nothing but flour on her hands and a padlock on her door. Martha, who had never once said something encouraging that she didn't mean. She thought about all of this on a Saturday morning in early summer, the first Saturday in several months that had started without a specific crisis requiring her immediate attention. The shop was open, Samuel was managing the front counter, Margaret had the kitchen well in hand, and Elena was standing outside the bakery on the sidewalk in the early morning light, with a cup of coffee she'd actually gotten to drink warm, looking at the main street of Silver Creek the way you look at something familiar that you're seeing clearly for the first time. The Whitmore sign was still above the door. She'd had the paint touched up 3 weeks ago, not replaced, touched up, restored, because the original lettering was her father's hand and she hadn't wanted to lose that. The wood behind it was still slightly warped from weather. She'd decided to leave that too. Nathaniel Blackwood came around the corner at the south end of the street on foot, which was unusual. She'd grown accustomed to seeing him arrive on horseback or by wagon, the way ranchmen generally moved around a frontier town. He was carrying something. She didn't recognize what it was until he got closer, a small crock, clay, sealed at the top. He stopped when he saw her standing outside. "I wasn't sure you'd be here this early," he said. "I'm always here this early." He looked at the crock he was carrying and then at her. "I was going through some things at the ranch. Old equipment storage. Found this." He held it out. She took it. It was lighter than she expected. The clay was old. She could see that in the way it had dried unevenly on one side, the slight irregularity of something made by hand rather than milled. There was a mark pressed into the bottom, a simple W, the kind you'd make with a stick in wet clay before it hardened. She held it very still. "It came with some equipment I purchased 6 years ago," Blackwood said, "from the previous owner of the property east of the ranch. I never knew what it was. My cook didn't use sourdough, so it just sat in storage." He paused. "Then I tasted your bread, and I asked you about the starter, and you said it was 40-some years old and your father had carried it from Missouri. And I started wondering." She turned the crock over. The clay seal at the top was old but intact. She pressed the surface gently with her thumb. "The previous owner," she said. "Do you know who he was before he owned the property?" "A man named Thomas Whitmore," Blackwood said. "According to the deed transfer, he sold the property in the late 1860s and moved into town. Her father had been 22 in the late 1860s. He'd moved to Silver Creek, bought the bakery building, married her mother, started the business that would take 30 years to build and 11 days to nearly lose. He'd carried a starter culture from Missouri, he'd told her once, hadn't explained more than that. The way he didn't explain more than the essential thing, just that he'd carried it, and it had survived the journey, and you didn't let something like that die if you could help it. This was the one that hadn't come with him. She understood, standing on the sidewalk with the crock in her hands, that she might be holding a version of the same culture her father had grown his from, a sibling strain fermented separately for 40 years, living a different life in storage without knowing what it was. Or she might be holding nothing relevant at all. The W on the bottom could mean anything, and the clay could be anyone's. But her hands were not steady, and Blackwood was looking at her with the expression of a man who'd understood before she had that this might matter. "Can I open it?" she asked. "It's yours," he said. "Whatever it is, it came from your family's land." She broke the clay seal carefully. The smell that came up from inside was unmistakably alive, the particular sharp, yeasty complexity that she knew better than almost any other thing in the world. She'd smelled that smell every morning for months, leaning over her father's crock in the kitchen, checking the culture the way he'd checked it every day without exception. This smelled older, deeper. The same family of smell, but further back in its own history. She stood there on the sidewalk in the early summer morning and didn't say anything for a while, and Blackwood didn't ask her to. "I'll need to test it," she said finally. "It might not be viable after this long in a sealed container. The culture might have gone dormant past the point of revival. What would you need to try?" "Warmth. A small flower feeding. 2 days to see if there's activity." She looked at him. "I've revived dormant cultures before. It doesn't always work." "But it sometimes does." "Yes," she said. "It sometimes does." She carried this crock inside and set it on the shelf above the work table, beside her father's notebook. Margaret came out of the kitchen, saw the crock, saw Elena's face, and asked no questions. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was also confirmation of something Elena had come to rely on, that Margaret's instincts about when to speak and when not to were almost always right. Blackwood came inside and stood at the counter the way he'd stood the first morning he'd walked in, studying the display, not performing interest but actually having it. He bought a loaf of the sourdough and a piece of the molasses cake and said he'd be back on Tuesday as usual, and he left. And Elena stood in the kitchen doorway watching him go and thought about how strange it was that the same man who'd walked in and asked about fermentation time on an otherwise empty morning had turned into the fixed point she was most sure of in a situation that had contained very little certainty. She'd thought about that more carefully in recent months. Not the business relationship. That was straightforward, documented, mutual. But the other thing, the thing that didn't have a category in her accounts ledger and couldn't be managed by writing it in a notebook. She wasn't experienced with the other thing. She'd spent most of her adult life inside the bakery or learning from the people who ran it, and the frontier didn't offer a great deal of space for the kind of reflection that might have otherwise prepared her for a man who showed up with an old crock because he'd wondered for 6 months whether it might matter to her and had been right. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She was aware that she didn't know. And she was aware that the not knowing was honest rather than a problem to be solved. And she held it the way she held most things she didn't fully understand, carefully, without forcing a conclusion. The revival of the second culture took 3 days, not 2. On the first day, nothing happened. She fed it a small flour mixture, covered it loosely, set it in the warmest corner of the kitchen near the original oven, and checked it morning and evening with the patience of someone who knew that biological things moved on their own schedule. On the second day, she thought she saw the beginning of surface activity, a slight doming of the surface that could have been the culture or could have been her wanting it to be. She didn't let herself decide. She fed it again and covered it and went back to the rest of the work. On the third day, the smell hit her before she reached the shelf. That smell. The deep, live, yeasty sharpness that meant something was happening inside the clay. She took the cover off, and the surface had domed distinctly, and there were the small bubbles at the edge that meant fermentation was active and the culture was alive. She sat down on the stool beside the work table and stayed there for a moment. Margaret came in for the morning check. She looked at the crock, looked at Elena's face, looked at the crock again. "It worked," she said. "It worked." Margaret put water on for coffee. "Are you going to merge them, the two cultures?" Elena had been thinking about this for 3 days. "No," she said. "They've been separate for 40 years. They're not the same anymore. I'll maintain them separately and see what each one produces." "2 starters," Margaret said. "2 starters. Different bread from each." She looked at the crock from the ranch. "One from what my father brought from Missouri. One from what he left behind when he moved to town." She incorporated the second culture into a test batch that afternoon, working it carefully, learning its behavior the way she'd learned the second oven's behavior, by paying attention without assumption. The bread it produced was different from her father's established sourdough. Not better or worse, but different. A slightly more complex tang, a crumb with more irregular openings that she thought was a result of a more active fermentation. It was the bread of a culture that had been living a different life in a sealed crock in a ranch storage room, and that history was in every loaf. She put one of the test loaves on the shelf above the work table, beside her father's notebook. She didn't name the 2 cultures officially, not on paper, not out loud. But in her own thinking, she called the one her father had brought with him, the one that came, and the one she'd recovered from Blackwood's storage, the ones that stayed. It was an inexact description, but it was hers. Silas Drummond left Silver Creek in late summer. She heard about it from Martha, who heard it from the harness shop, which had heard it from Drummond's own former storekeep, a young man named Albert who'd worked for Drummond for 2 years, and who had, Martha reported with a neutrality that didn't entirely conceal what she thought of the situation, found other employment without difficulty because he was a competent young man who'd simply been working for the wrong person. Drummond hadn't failed spectacularly. He'd contracted slowly over the season. Webb's refusal to sign the exclusive arrangement had closed off the supply chain disruption he'd planned, and Victoria's letter had made other merchant partners cautious, and the Banking Commission review, though it had concluded without formal findings, had attached a scrutiny to his name that made financing for his next move more difficult to secure. He'd simply found that Silver Creek was no longer the right market for his particular methods, and departed for somewhere that hadn't yet formed an opinion about him. Elena noted it in her operational notebook the same way she noted equipment repairs and supply order changes. One line, factual, without editorializing. Drummond left Silver Creek. Supply chain risk resolved. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She'd spent enough energy on Drummond's maneuvering to understand that the energy was the cost, and the cost had been real regardless of the outcome. What she felt was something closer to the relief of setting down a weight she'd been carrying in her peripheral awareness for months. Not heavy enough to stop her, but present enough that its absence made the world slightly quieter. The Langford contract formal renewal came in September, with expanded terms. Victoria came through Silver Creek in person. She preferred to sign significant renewals in person, she'd mentioned once. Not from sentimentality, but because she found that the people who were worth doing long-term business with were the people who treated a handshake and a room the same way they treated a signed document. Elena met her at Blackwood's ranch again, at the same table, and they negotiated for 2 hours over the expanded volume and the revised pricing structure, and Victoria struck out 2 clauses she found imprecise, and Elena held firm on the payment timing terms, and they found an agreement that was better than the original in every specific that mattered. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Elena thought about the first time she'd sat at that table with the specific feeling of someone trying not to let the size of the opportunity show on her face. She didn't feel like that now. She felt like herself, which was a thing she'd undervalued on that first morning and had come to understand better. She drove back to Silver Creek in the early evening, the light long and flat across the frontier in the particular way it went in September, the shadows pulling out behind everything and the dust on the road catching the orange of it. She'd made this drive enough times now that it was familiar. The low section of the road that flooded in spring was dry and firm. The east-facing ridge caught the evening light in a way she'd started looking for. The smell of the grass different in early fall than in any other season. She brought the wagon back to the ranch to return it to Peter's care, as she always did after a meeting, and found Blackwood in the yard talking with one of the ranch hands about something involving the fence line on the northern pasture. He looked up when she arrived and said something to the hand and came over. "How did it go?" he asked. "Expanded contract, better terms." She climbed down from the wagon. "Victoria doesn't give you more than you earn." "No," he agreed. "She doesn't." He took the horse's bridle while she secured the back of the wagon, and they were standing in the yard in the early evening quiet, and she had the thought, not for the first time, but with more clarity than before, that she could say what she'd been thinking about for several months, or she could not say it, and both choices were available to her, and both had consequences she couldn't fully predict. She'd always been better at decisions she could work out in a notebook. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. "About the fact that you drove to town on foot last month to bring me a crock from your storage room," she said, "and I've been trying to decide what that was." He looked at her steadily. The late light was doing the thing it did in September, and his face was in the warm edge of it. "What did you decide?" "That it was probably more than procurement management." A pause. "Yes," he said. "It was." "I don't know how to do this well," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I've spent the last 8 months building a bread operation from 40 pounds of flour, and I know how to do that considerably better than I know how to do this." "I know." Something in the way he said it had the particular weight of something he'd been sitting with for a while. "I've been running a cattle operation for 20 years, and I'm better at that than I am at this too. I don't think that disqualifies either of us." She thought about that. "No," she said. "Probably not." They stood in the yard for a moment in the way of 2 people who've just said something that can't be unsaid, and are taking stock of the new terrain. "I'm not looking to be managed," she said, "or helped, or positioned." "I know what you built," he said. "I watched you build it. I'm not interested in any version of this where that's not exactly what it is." She believed him. That was the thing about Blackwood she'd been certain of almost from the first conversation, that he said what he meant, not perfectly and not always at the right moment, but genuinely. He didn't use words to maneuver, he used them to mean things. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "All right," she said again. "We'll figure it out, the same way everything else gets figured out." He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed. Not the polite, social kind of laugh, but the real kind, surprised out of him. And she'd never heard it before, and it turned out it was a good sound. That's not romantic, he said. No, she agreed. But it's honest. I'll take honest, he said. She took the road back to town as the last of the light left the sky, and arrived at the bakery just as Samuel was locking the front door from outside, having finished the end-of-day routine without being asked, as he now regularly did. He handed her the keys and said the second oven's left chamber had been running 2 degrees warm all afternoon, and he'd adjusted the rack position, but she should probably check it in the morning. I'll look at it at 4:15, she said. He nodded and headed toward the harness shop, and she stood outside the bakery for a moment with the keys in her hand and looked up at the sign. Whitmore Bakery. Est. 1871. The paint on the letters was fresh. The W was her father's original mark, the curves of it slightly uneven the way hand-lettered signs were, the wood behind it still warped from 30 years of weather because she'd decided to leave that part exactly as it was. She thought about what she would have said to herself on the morning she'd found the padlock on the door, flour still on her hands, bread still in the oven. Standing across the street looking at a notice and hearing Grimes's voice through the glass. That woman with the 40 pounds of flour, and the cold kitchen and the notebook she hadn't found yet, who was about to go back into the building to pull 3 loaves from the oven and refuse to cry in front of a banker. She wouldn't have told her it would be fine. Fine was not a useful word, and had never been true in any uncomplicated sense. She would have said, it's going to be hard in ways you can't predict, and the help you need will come from directions you don't expect, and some of the things that save you will be small enough to fit in a clay crock, and some of them will be decisions you make at 9 in the evening on a street you've walked 1,000 times, and the whole of it will be yours. Yours in a way that nothing taken or given or handed down can be, because you'll have earned every piece of it in the particular currency of days that start at 4:15 and hands that learn by being wrong. She would have said, the oven will feel like yours eventually, not the building, the oven, the work. She unlocked the front door and went inside. The kitchen was clean and quiet, the ovens banked for the night, the 2 crocks on the shelf above the work table catching the last light from the west window. Her father's crock beside the one Blackwood had carried from storage, 2 cultures from the same source living their different lives, and both of them hers now, both of them alive. She checked the second oven's left chamber the way Samuel had described, held her hand at rack height, counting the temperature variance by feel, the way her father had done it before the gauge, the way she now did it by preference rather than necessity. 2 degrees warm, he'd said. She felt 3, maybe 4. She'd swapped the rack position in the morning and run a test batch through before the main production. She wrote it in her notebook. Not his. Hers. She'd filled most of it by now, pages of adjustments and errors and things she'd learned and things she'd gotten wrong and come back to and gotten less wrong the second time. There were entries about flour ratios and oven behavior and the seeded wheat and the molasses cake and the revival of the second culture. There were entries about Margaret's catch on the overproofed loaf, about Samuel's first unsupervised timing adjustment, about Henry's way of checking axle pins without being asked. There were entries about the 4 days of being turned down after Grimes padlocked the door. About the morning she'd moved the bread to the window and sold 11 loaves instead of 4. About the meeting at Heller and Associates where she'd declined the first rate offered and come away with something she could build on. She turned to the last written page, read what was there, and then turned to the next blank one. She picked up the pencil. She didn't write anything profound. She didn't have a phrase for the whole of it, for the months and the mistakes and the 2 crocks on the shelf, and the man in the yard, and the contract signed at the ranch table and the cured burn on her forearm, and the Whitmore sign with the original W slightly uneven above the door. She wrote the date. She wrote, second oven left chamber running warm. Check rack position at 4:15. Then she closed the notebook and put it beside her father's on the shelf, and she went home through the quiet street, and behind her the bakery held its warmth through the summer night, and both ovens waited for morning, and the 2 cultures on the shelf above the work table kept doing what they had always done, what they would continue to do regardless of who was watching, the patient, invisible, necessary work of staying alive. The assessor from Morrison's was a woman in her early 50s named Clara Whitfield, who arrived on a Thursday morning without announcing herself beyond the note Edmund had received the previous day. She walked in during the middle of the morning rush, which Elena later decided was either coincidence or deliberate, and she stood against the far wall with a notebook and watched the operation for 45 minutes without introducing herself to anyone except Elena. She watched Margaret work the counter. She watched Samuel and Ruth in the kitchen. She looked at the oven, the coal arrangement, the proofing racks, the crates stacked by the back door ready for the Friday Blackwood delivery. She watched the line move and she watched the bread move. And she counted, Elena could tell, with the quiet accuracy of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic about throughput and capacity. When the rush cleared, she sat at the counter and opened her notebook and asked questions for an hour. She asked about the Caldwell's arrangement and the terms. She asked about the Blackwood contract's exit clause, which Edmund had flagged, and Elena gave the same answer she'd given Edmund. She'd accepted the asymmetric clause because she needed the contract more than she needed the protection, and the clause had a 45-day notice period, not 30, which was the best she'd gotten. She asked about the traveling loaf and the Victoria Langford arrangement, and Elena laid out the trial run and the written confirmation of the root hold and the pending formalization. Clara wrote things down with a shorthand Elena couldn't read. She asked about staffing costs, about coal costs per batch, about the rent arrangement on the building. That last one made Elena explain the Harold Fitch situation, which she did plainly. The default, the note transfer, the extension, the current balance due in 30 days assuming Morrison's took its time, less if they moved fast. Clara looked up when Elena finished. "You're telling me there's a hostile creditor with a note coming due in 30 days. I'm telling you Morrison's is the reason that's not a crisis," Elena said. "If Morrison's approves the refinancing, I pay Harold Fitch off and he has no further claim. If Morrison's doesn't approve, I have a problem. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Most people applying for refinancing don't tell me the worst case plainly," she said. "I'd rather you know it from me than find it in the title search," Elena said. Clara wrote something down. "The note in your production package," she said. "The one about the bakery's history." "Yes." "Who wrote that?" "I did," Elena said. Clara looked at what she'd written. "It's useful," she said, which was not warm but was something. She closed her notebook. She looked around the kitchen one more time, at the oven that was still warm from the morning, at the starter crock on the windowsill that Elena kept there the way her mother had, in the warmth and light. "I'll have a recommendation to the review committee by Monday," she said. "You'll have an answer by Wednesday." She left without buying bread, which was fine. The conversation was the point. The 4 days between Thursday and Wednesday were the longest Elena had experienced since the day her mother died, which was a different kind of long, and not a comparison she made lightly. She worked through them the way she worked through everything, in the kitchen, in the rhythm of the bread, in the specific physical reality of the oven and the dough that gave the mind something to do that was not catastrophize. On Saturday, Victoria Longford's supply wagon came back through Silver Creek. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat, handed Elena a note from Victoria along with an empty crate that had held the trial loaves. The note said, "All 20 loaves arrived with quality intact. 3 stops requested immediate regular supply. 2 stops asked specifically if the bread could be ordered separately. Formalize on the agreed terms. I'll have a signed contract to you by end of month." Elena read the note twice and handed it to Margaret, who read it and handed it back and said, "I'll tell Samuel." That evening, Nathaniel came by after the close, which was becoming a pattern that neither of them named. He knocked at the back door, which was also becoming a pattern, and Elena let him in, and they sat at the work table in the kitchen with the oven cooling around them, and she showed him Victoria's note. He read it and set it down. "That's the Victoria Langford contract," he said. "Almost," she said. "End of month." "That's the Victoria Langford contract," he said again, with a certainty that was not about the words but about what he'd understood before she'd finished explaining. She looked at him. She was tired in the way she was always tired now, the sustained structural tired of someone running at higher capacity than the body was fully endorsing, a tired that sleep helped but didn't fix. She was also something else, something she hadn't had room to feel clearly in months, which was beginning to believe the thing she was building was real. "When Morrison's comes back Wednesday," she said, "if it's yes, I can pay Harold off, restructure cleanly, and have a functioning business with 3 supply relationships and a viable operation. And if it's no," he said, "if it's no, I have 30 days with Harold's extension and a Victoria Langford contract I can take to a different lender." She looked at the table. "It's harder, but it's not over." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the oven and the starter on the windowsill and the notebook on the shelf, and then he looked at her. "You've built something remarkable," he said. "I want to say that clearly, not as encouragement, as a statement of what I can see." Elena looked at him. She didn't deflect it, and she didn't lean into it. She just held it, the way she held things that were true and mattered and were also complicated. "I had help," she said. "You took help differently than most people do," he said. "That's not the same as not having it." She thought about that. She thought about the contract she'd reshaped, and the extension she'd taken from Harold without pretending it was something other than what it was, and the letter from Victoria she'd asked for directly, and the way she'd told Clara Whitfield the worst case before the title search could. She'd taken help, yes. She'd taken it on terms that let her remain the one building the thing. She didn't know how to say that to him without it sounding like she was explaining herself, so she didn't try. "Stay for coffee," she said instead. "The pot's not bad tonight." He stayed. They talked about bread and about the Eastern Ridge Road and about what Caldwell's Miller Douglas had apparently said to Nathaniel when he'd run into him at a supply meeting in the county seat, which was that Elena Whitmore had an instinct for flour that he hadn't seen in 30 years of milling. They talked about Samuel and the starch wash and the scoring pattern and whether the traveling loaf could eventually carry further than 4 days with a different fermentation approach. They talked about things that were real and present and not about the note or Morrison's or Harold Fitch. And the kitchen was warm with the residual heat of the oven, and outside Silver Creek was doing what it always did at night, settling into itself with no particular drama. She did not think about Wednesday. She thought about it a little, but less than she would have expected, sitting there with the coffee in her hands, and the starter alive on the windowsill, and the bread that had gone out to 32 frontier stops still traveling the distances she'd made it to travel. Wednesday would be what it was. She had built what she'd built, and it was real, and no one was going to be able to say otherwise regardless of what Morrison's decided, and that was the thing she kept coming back to when the arithmetic got too heavy and the 30-day window felt too close. The bread existed, the people eating it existed, the kitchen and the team and the contracts and the reputation that had rebuilt itself from 40 pounds of flour and a cold oven. Those existed. They were hers, and she had made them, and that was the part that was already decided. Wednesday came the way important days always came, ordinary on the surface, the oven needing coal at the same hour, the starter needing feeding, the dough needing hands. Elena had learned in the past months that the days that changed things didn't announce themselves differently from the days that didn't. They arrived in the dark like all the others and asked the same things of you, and you either showed up or you didn't. She showed up. The morning ran the way Tuesday and Thursday mornings ran now. The line forming before she opened, Margaret at the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had found, in her 60s, work that used what she actually was, rather than a diminished version of it. Samuel and Ruth in the kitchen moving in the rhythm they'd built together over 2 months. Elena worked the oven and watched the clock and thought about bread and tried not to think about Morrison's, which was the same as thinking about Morrison's but with less direct damage. Edmund had said she'd have an answer by Wednesday. He had not said what time on Wednesday. At 1:30, the morning line had cleared and Ruth was cleaning down the back work table, and Samuel was starting the noon batch and Margaret was counting the morning's tin when the door opened and Edmund Price came in, which was unusual because Edmund did not generally come to her. She went to people. He was a man who stayed in his office and received. He was not smiling, which told her nothing. Edmund Price did not smile to deliver good news. He came to the counter and put his hat on it and looked at her with the expression she now understood meant he was deciding how to say something rather than deciding what to say. "They approved it," he said. Elena put both hands on the counter. "Full refinancing," he said. 30-year term, current rate, with a structured repayment that accounts for the Victoria Langford contract coming in as anticipated volume. Clara Whitfield's assessment was, he paused, choosing the word, favorable. They characterized the operation as an established business recovering from a succession event rather than a new business with unproven performance. Succession event. That was what they called it when your parents died and left you the thing they'd built, and you had to figure out what to do with it. "The disbursement goes to Harold Fitch's note directly," Edmund continued. "I'll handle the transfer. You'll need to sign the Morrison's documents by Friday. After that, Fitch has no claim on the property." "Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. "Elena, You can breathe." She breathed. It was not a dramatic moment. Margaret was still counting coins behind her. Samuel was still measuring flour in the back. Ruth was wringing out her cleaning cloth at the sink. The oven was doing what the oven did. Nothing in the room changed when Edmund said the words, because the room was already what it had become. A working kitchen in a functioning bakery, and it had been that for weeks, and Morrison's decision confirmed it rather than created it. But she breathed differently after he said it. She hadn't noticed how shallow her breathing had been until it wasn't. "Thank you, Edmund," she said. He picked up his hat. He paused, which was unusual. Edmund did not generally pause. "Your father came to me once," he said. "About 15 years ago. He wanted help writing a will. He sat in my office and talked about the bakery for 40 minutes before we got to the legal part. He said," Edmund looked at the hat in his hands. "He said the bakery would outlast him because whoever ran it after him would understand what it was for." He looked at her. "He was right," he said, "though I suspect he was thinking of it differently than how it turned out." He left before she could respond, which was probably intentional, because Edmund Price was a man who understood when a sentence was better left as the last one. Elena stood at the counter for a moment alone, because Margaret had tactfully taken the tin to the back room and the kitchen sounds were giving her space. She hadn't asked for but was grateful for. She looked at the shelf behind the counter where the loan document had sat for weeks, and where it no longer sat because she'd put it in a drawer 3 weeks ago when the extension cleared and she couldn't stand looking at it anymore. Her father had been right about something. She had understood what the bakery was for. She was just not certain, standing in it now with Morrison's approval in hand, and Harold Fitch's claim about to be extinguished, that she'd understood it the same way he had. He'd built it to feed a town. That was what it was for, to him. Not an abstraction, but a literal daily function. Bread as community infrastructure. The oven as something the town organized around. She had understood that. She had also built it into something he hadn't imagined, with contracts running to 32 frontier stops, and a traveling loaf that was still in motion on Victoria Langford's supply wagons somewhere in the territory right now. She wasn't sure if that was an extension of what he'd built or something different. She decided it was both, and that both was okay. Harold Fitch received the Morrisons' transfer on a Thursday, one day after Edmund delivered the signed documents. He sent a note to the bakery that simply read, "Note satisfied, no further claim." It was signed in his careful hand and had no other content, which was its own kind of communication. Harold did not add what didn't need to be there. Elena put the note in the drawer with the old loan document and closed the drawer and did not open it again. The Victoria Langford contract arrived by messenger on the following Monday. Formal, typed, with Victoria's signature at the bottom in the same clean, deliberate hand as the letter she'd sent weeks earlier. The terms were exactly as they'd discussed. Elena read it through twice, found nothing unexpected, and signed it at the counter with Margaret watching and Samuel leaning in the kitchen doorway and Ruth pretending not to be listening from the back. She held it up after she signed it. Not for drama, just to show them what they'd built toward. Margaret nodded once. Samuel said, 2,400 loaves a month. Ruth said, "We're going to need more coal." They were right on both counts. The question of the second oven had been sitting in Elena's notebook for 6 weeks by the time the Langford contract was signed. She'd been circling it, making notes about it, running the cost projections and setting them aside and coming back to them. The existing oven could be pushed, and she'd pushed it, but pushing it had costs. More precise fuel management, higher maintenance attention, a narrower margin for error when the volume ran high. A second oven meant more capacity and more resilience, but it also meant a capital expenditure she'd been reluctant to commit to before the refinancing was settled. The refinancing was settled. She made the decision on a Tuesday morning, standing at the oven with the first batch of the day coming out, thinking about the way the kitchen worked now and the way it would need to work in 3 months when the Langford routes hit full volume. She needed more oven before she needed more people. The people were already finding their rhythm. The equipment was the constraint. She brought Nathaniel the question not because she needed his money. She didn't. The Morrisons' refinancing terms had included a small capital improvement provision she'd negotiated in at Edmund's suggestion, but because he'd built a ranch operation that managed sustained logistics at volume, and she wanted to know what he knew about sourcing heavy iron equipment on the frontier. He came to the bakery on a Wednesday evening, which had become the pattern without either of them deciding it was. And they sat at the work table with the oven cooling and the notebook open between them, and she showed him the specifications she'd worked out for what a second oven needed to be. He looked at it carefully. He asked 2 questions about the flue configuration and whether the existing chimney could support a second draw, and then said he knew a metalworks in the county seat that had built a custom smoker for his ranch operation and did clean work at fair prices. He could get her an introduction. "That's enough," she said. "I can do the rest." He looked at her over the notebook. "I know you can," he said. "You know that's not why I offered." She looked at him. This was the thing about Nathaniel Blackwood that she'd been turning over for weeks, in the spaces between batches and deliveries and bank documents. The way he offered things. He offered without the expectation of receiving credit for the offer, without the implication that the offer created a debt, without the particular proprietary quality that some men attach to helping women they were interested in. He offered as a person who had things to give and found someone who could use them and gave them. That was rarer than the frontier pretended it was. "I know it isn't," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the oven, the starter on the windowsill, the notebook that was now almost entirely full. 4 months of calculations and adjustments and decisions, and the accumulated working record of how the Whitmore Bakery had remade itself. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Probably," she said. "What has the bakery become from here?" he said. "Not the contracts or the volume. What are you building toward?" Elena looked at the question. She hadn't been asked it by anyone, including herself, in those terms. She'd been building toward survival, and then toward stability, and then toward the Langford contract, and each of those had been sufficient as a destination while she was reaching it. But beyond them, what was the shape of the thing? She thought about it honestly. "A place that makes something real," she said finally. "Not just food people eat because they need to eat. Something they'd go out of their way for. Something the people in those 32 frontier stops are glad arrived when it does." She looked at the oven. "My grandfather built this bakery because he thought a town needed good bread the way it needed water. I used to think that was sentiment. I don't think that anymore." Nathaniel was quiet. Then, "Why not?" "Because I've watched what the bread does," she said. "At your ranch, the men save the fruited loaves. They don't eat them first. They set them aside. For later. That's not about calories. That's about the thing the bread represents, which is that someone thought about what they might want, not just what they needed." She paused. "I think my grandfather understood that. I think I'm just now catching up to him." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time with the quality of attention she'd come to think of as simply his, present and considering and not trying to arrive at a conclusion before the information warranted one. "He'd have liked what you've done with it," he said. "I don't know," she said. He might have thought I turned it into something commercial." "Wouldn't he have been right?" "Maybe," she said, "but the bread is still real. The people eating it are still real. I don't think what the box looks like changes what's inside it." He picked up his coffee cup. She'd made coffee without thinking about it at some point in the last hour, and it had gone only slightly cold. He drank it without complaining, which she appreciated. "I have a question I've been carrying for a while," he said, in a tone that was different from the conversation they'd been having, slightly more careful. She waited. "I'd like to have dinner with you," he said. "Not at the bakery. Somewhere else. As something other than a business conversation." Elena looked at him. She'd been aware this was a direction, in the way you were aware of weather coming in before it arrived. Not certain, but readable if you knew how to read it. She hadn't decided in advance what she'd say, because deciding in advance felt like managing something that deserved more honesty than that. "I think I'd like that," she said, "when I'm not thinking about the second oven every waking hour." He almost smiled, the full version this time, which reached his eyes and changed his face in a way that was different from the partial version she'd been seeing for months. "I can wait," he said. "You're good at waiting," she said. "I've had practice," he said. She didn't ask at what. Some things were earned by time and not by questions. The second oven arrived in November, 6 weeks after she'd placed the order, built at the metalworks in the county seat to the specifications she'd worked out in her notebook and installed over 3 days by 2 men from the fabricating shop who worked with the concentrated focus of people who took their craft as seriously as she took hers. The flue configuration worked. The draw balanced correctly with the existing chimney. When she fired it for the first time on the fourth day, standing alone in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, with the first heat moving across her face from both sides of the room, she thought about her grandfather's oven and what it had survived and what it had produced and what it now had beside it. And she felt something she didn't try to name because naming it would have required simplifying it, and it wasn't simple. She put the first batch in the new oven and the second batch in the old one and stood between them and watched the timers she kept in her head. Both batches came out right. By December, the Whitmore Bakery was supplying Blackwood Ranch 3 times a week, running 6 of Victoria Langford's supply routes to schedule, and selling off the front counter every morning until they sold out. The morning line on Tuesdays and Thursdays still ran out the door, and Margaret had taken to putting a small chalkboard outside with the day's available varieties, which people had started consulting the way they consulted weather signs, as useful information about how to plan the next hour. Thomas still came by most mornings. He was 13 now, and he'd started helping Samuel with small prep tasks on Saturday mornings, in a way that had begun as informal and was becoming something more deliberate. Elena hadn't offered him a job, and he hadn't asked for one, and they both understood that the arrangement was working and that formalizing it could wait until it needed to be formalized. She paid him in bread, for now, and he accepted it with the dignity he accepted everything. Hector Grimes had closed his bakery in October. She hadn't gloated about this because gloating was for people who had time for it, and also because Grimes had not been malicious. He'd simply made consistent, adequate bread and run out of reasons for people to choose adequate over something better. Elena had heard he'd gone back east, which she hoped was going better for him than Silver Creek had. She did not feel guilty about it. She thought about it once and decided she didn't and moved on. Cooper Dean had approached her in September to resume their supply relationship at the original price, after Harold Fitch's interest in pressuring him had apparently evaporated with Harold's interest in the bakery building. Elena had told him she had an arrangement with Caldwell's that was working and she was going to honor it, but that if Caldwell's ever had a supply disruption, she'd call him first. He'd accepted that with the particular relief of a man who'd expected less grace than he'd received. Harold Fitch himself she saw occasionally on Cedar Street. They nodded to each other in the way of people who had had a complicated transaction and come to a workable conclusion. He had not raised the partnership discussion again, and she had not raised it either, and she'd decided that the right answer was probably never, because having Harold Fitch as a partner was a kind of closeness to his methods that she didn't want, and the business didn't need his capital now that Morrison's had refinanced cleanly. Some things you worked through, not with. The dinner with Nathaniel happened on a Thursday evening in late November, at a place in the county seat that was 2 hours from Silver Creek by buggy, which was far enough that it was clearly a decision rather than a convenience. He drove. She sat beside him in the cold dark with a wool blanket across her knees and the stars coming up sharp and early the way they did in November, and they talked about the Eastern Ridge Road and the Caldwell's Miller Douglas, who had apparently started experimenting with his own sourdough after a conversation with Elena at the mill in October, which made her laugh in a way she hadn't expected. "He sent me a sample," she said. "It was earnest." "Was it good?" "It was earnest," she said again, which made him laugh, and she found she liked the sound of it. Uncomplicated, genuine, not managed. Dinner was not effortless. They were two people who had developed a working relationship across months of business and were now trying to understand what else they were, which was the kind of thing that took time and made some silences awkward and some conversations veer somewhere unexpected. He told her about his wife, not in detail, not in the manner of confession, but plainly, because she'd asked plainly, because she thought he deserved to be asked rather than have her avoid it. His wife had died 3 years ago in the second year of a sickness that had no good name, and he had kept running the ranch and expanded it in the years after, which was either a way of grieving or a way of not grieving, and possibly both. "I don't know how to be in company the way I used to," he said. "I'm better at it than I was 2 years ago. I'm not all the way back." "I don't know if back is the right direction," she said. He looked at her. "My mother said once that grief didn't end. It just changed what it asked of you," she said. "I used to think that was bleak. Now I think it's accurate." "She was right," he said. "She usually was," Elena said. "It was irritating." He did smile at that fully. "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked," he said. "She would have liked you," Elena said. "She had a type."
What type? People who actually meant what they said.
Said, Elena said. He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant around them was doing what restaurants did. Other people's conversations, and the clink of things, and the warmth of a room that had been heated for human occupation. And it was not uncomfortable, sitting in it with him. It was just real, with the texture of real things, rather than the smooth surface of things that had been managed into impressiveness. I mean what I say, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. In the last week of December, Elena found herself standing outside the bakery at dusk, the way Harold Fitch had stood looking at it the morning he'd come with his padlock and his paper. But from the opposite side of the transaction, from the outside looking in at the light in the windows, and the warmth that she knew was radiating from 2 ovens instead of 1. The sign above the door still needed new lettering. She kept meaning to do it, and kept not finding the time, and she'd come to think of it as the last piece of the old bakery that still looked like the version she'd inherited rather than the version she'd made. She would get to it. In the spring, probably. She looked at it and thought about the morning she'd stood at this counter with 40 pounds of flour and a cold oven and Harold Fitch's padlock, and the particular quality of loss that comes from realizing you're not just grieving people but also the version of the future you'd assumed was coming. She had been 24 and alone and in debt, and the town had been watching with the kind of sympathy that wanted a sad story rather than a recovered one. She had not given them the sad story. She had given them the other kind. What she understood now, that she hadn't understood in any clear way at the beginning, was that the people who underestimated her had not been wrong about the odds. The odds, examined honestly, had not been in her favor. Starting with 40 pounds of flour and a default notice and a town that had already partially moved on, those were real obstacles, not invented ones. The people who told her to sell and walk away had not been cruel. They'd been reading the situation accurately. What they hadn't been reading was her, and that was not a criticism of them. You couldn't read someone accurately until you had enough information, and they didn't have it. She had built the information. She had given them something to read that hadn't existed before. That was the thing she kept coming back to, standing in the December cold with the bakery lit behind her. The lesson she would carry from this year was not that determination conquered obstacles. It was more complicated than that. Determination alone, applied to a real problem, was not sufficient. She had been determined in the first months after her father died, and the bakery had still declined, because determination without strategy and help, an honest assessment of what you didn't know, was just stubbornness wearing a better name. What had worked was something more specific, the willingness to be accurate about what she had, which turned out to be more than she'd thought. The willingness to take help without letting it redefine who was in charge. The willingness to tell Clara Whitfield the worst case before the title search revealed it, because honesty was a form of control even when it felt like vulnerability. The willingness to extend the bread itself, to make it travel, to make it go to 32 frontier stops, to let Samuel change the scoring pattern, and let Margaret talk to customers, and let Thomas tell her about his uncle's smoker register. None of that was natural to her. All of it had been chosen. The door opened behind her and Margaret leaned out into the cold. Samuel's asking about the Thursday batch, she said. He wants to try the new grain blend on the sourdough. Tell him yes, Elena said. I want to taste it before we commit to it, but yes. Margaret went back inside. Elena stayed a moment longer in the cold, looking at the sign that needed repainting and the windows that showed the kitchen light and the 2 ovens that were, right now, cooling from the day's last batch, with the slow release of heat that brick held longer than anything else she knew. Her grandfather had built one of those ovens. She had built the other. That was not the ending of the story. It was just the shape of it so far. What the first year of building looked like when you'd survived it and could turn around and see it whole. There would be more years, more batches, more problems with more edges. The Langford routes would have difficult seasons. The Caldwell's arrangement would hit friction at some point. Nathaniel was a complicated man in the early stages of uncomplicated himself, and she was a woman who had spent a year building walls that were also foundations, and understanding the difference between those two things was work that took longer than a year. There was no version of this story where everything was resolved and the remaining difficulties were comfortable and the questions were all answered. Life on the frontier had never promised that, and she'd never wanted a promise like that anyway, because promises like that asked you to stop being fully awake to what was around you, and she intended to stay awake. What she had was enough, and what enough meant had changed considerably since the morning she'd had 40 pounds of flour and a cold oven and a padlock on the counter. She turned and went back inside. The smell of the bakery came over her the way it always did. Warm and specific and layered with everything the kitchen had been doing all day. The bread and the coal and the starter. And beneath all of it, faint and almost imagined, something that might have been the ghost of every loaf that had ever come out of that old oven. The 40 years of daily bread her family had made in this building before she was the one making it. She hung her coat and went to check the starter. It was vigorous. It always was, now. The culture her mother had kept for 11 years, run through a hard winter, and a year of near loss, and the changes that came from different hands and different temperatures, and the particular adjustments Elena had made, not because she'd planned them, but because she'd had to. And the having to had changed things in ways she was still discovering. It was not her mother's starter anymore. It was not her mother's starter either. It was what it had become, which was both of those things and the year between them, and whatever the years ahead would make of it in Elena's hands, living and adapting and feeding forward the same way living things did when they were given the right conditions and someone who understood what they were. She covered the crock and banked the ovens and checked the morning's coal and turned off the lamp in the front room, and the bakery settled into the dark and the cold outside, and the particular quiet of a building that had been working all day and was resting now, in the way of things that did real work. She locked the door and walked home through Silver Creek in the December dark, past the houses with their lamps lit, and the distant sound of the creek she'd been hearing since she was small. And she thought about her grandfather in his coat with the starter wrapped in cloth, and her father counting things, and her mother keeping everything alive for reasons she didn't always explain. She thought about what they'd given her and what she'd made with it. It was not what any of them had planned. It was better, in the ways that the unplanned things sometimes were, rougher at the edges, more honestly earned, more genuinely hers. She went home, and she slept, and in 4 hours she would be up again to start the fire. She didn't mind. The fire was the part she'd always liked best.